The Nazis tried to create zombie soldiers using actual corpses. Tonight you'll discover 100 classified military experiments from World War II that governments buried for decades. But here's what they don't want you knowing. Some of these projects never actually ended. The year was 1939, and the world was about to witness the most devastating conflict in human history. But what most people don't realize is that World War II wasn't just fought with tanks, planes, and battleships. It was also fought in laboratories, behind closed doors, where scientists raced against time to develop weapons and technologies that would make science fiction seem tame. Every major power knew the brutal truth: whoever invented the deadliest weapons first would likely win the war. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Germany had already shown their military might by steamrolling through Europe. The United States was scrambling to catch up. The Soviet Union was developing their own secret programs, and Japan, well, they were pursuing some of the most horrific experiments imaginable. Laboratory lights burned bright throughout the night in Berlin, Washington, Moscow, and Tokyo. Scientists worked around the clock, fueled by caffeine, patriotism, and the terrifying knowledge that failure meant their countries might cease to exist. Sleep became a luxury few could afford when the fate of millions hung in the balance. The early years of the war saw an explosion of chemical and medical experiments that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. Some discoveries would save countless lives, others would haunt humanity for decades to come. The line between scientific progress and moral horror became dangerously blurred as researchers justified increasingly extreme methods in the name of national survival. Germany led the charge with their systematic approach to military science. Their scientists weren't just creating new weapons, they were reimagining warfare itself. Chemical compounds that could kill from miles away, medical experiments designed to help soldiers survive impossible conditions, aviation research that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. The Nazi regime poured enormous resources into these projects, convinced that superior technology would guarantee their 1,000-year Reich. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American scientists were forming the Office of Scientific Research and Development. This wasn't your typical government agency filled with bureaucrats shuffling papers. These were brilliant minds working on projects so secret that even today, some details remain classified. They developed everything from life-saving penicillin to bizarre psychological weapons designed to exploit enemy superstitions. The Soviet Union took a different approach entirely. Their research focused heavily on human endurance and survival under extreme conditions. Russian winters had always been their greatest ally, and they wanted to understand exactly how far the human body could be pushed before it broke. Their experiments would make even hardened soldiers cringe. Then there was Japan's biological warfare program, operating in the shadows of occupied Manchuria. Unit 731 became synonymous with some of the most disturbing medical experiments ever conducted. They didn't just want to win the war, they wanted to develop weapons that could wipe out entire populations without firing a single bullet. Fear drove these scientific pursuits more than curiosity. Intelligence reports, whether accurate or not, suggested that enemy nations were making breakthrough discoveries. Nobody wanted to be caught off guard by some revolutionary weapon they hadn't anticipated. This paranoia led to increasingly desperate and dangerous research projects. Scientists who had once focused on improving human life suddenly found themselves designing ways to end it more efficiently. Medical researchers who took oaths to do no harm were pressured to conduct experiments that violated every ethical principle they had ever learned. The war created a moral crisis in laboratories worldwide. But here's what makes this period so fascinating from a historical perspective. Many of these wartime experiments, despite their horrific origins, led to medical and technological breakthroughs that we still use today. Penicillin mass production saved millions of lives. Rocket technology eventually put humans on the moon. Even some of the most disturbing human experiments contributed to our understanding of hypothermia, high-altitude survival, and infectious diseases. The race for military supremacy created an environment where normal scientific ethics were suspended. Researchers convinced themselves that the greater good justified extreme measures. After all, if their experiments could save their soldiers and defeat fascism, weren't they morally obligated to pursue every possible advantage? What's particularly striking is how quickly these programs expanded. Projects that started with small teams of scientists grew into massive operations involving thousands of researchers, test subjects, and support staff. Military budgets for scientific research skyrocketed as governments realized that the next great weapon might come from a laboratory rather than a factory. The pressure to produce results led to shortcuts that would never be acceptable in peacetime. Safety protocols were ignored. Human subjects were recruited through deception or coercion. Animal testing reached unprecedented scales. The urgency of war created a scientific environment where the ends always justified the means. As we delve deeper into these wartime experiments, we'll discover how this desperate pursuit of military advantage led to some of the most controversial research in human history. Starting with Nazi Germany's high-altitude survival experiments, where prisoners became unwilling test subjects in a quest to help German pilots survive the impossible conditions they faced in the skies above Europe. The year was 1942, and Nazi Germany had a problem. Their pilots kept dying when they bailed out at high altitudes. Not from bullets or crashes, but from something invisible and deadly military, the thin air itself. So they decided to find out exactly what happened to the human body when it was starved of oxygen at 30,000 feet. Their solution? Turn prisoners into test subjects at Dachau concentration camp. Dr. Sigmund Rascher led these experiments with the cold efficiency of a man studying lab rats. He had a low-pressure chamber built that could simulate the conditions pilots faced when ejected from their aircraft. The chamber looked innocent enough. Metal box with thick glass windows. But inside, it became a death trap that mimicked the hostile environment of the upper atmosphere. Here's how it worked. Prisoners were forced into the chamber while guards sealed them inside. Then came the real horror. The air was slowly sucked out, dropping the pressure to match what you'd find 6 miles above the earth. The subjects couldn't breathe properly. Their blood literally began to boil from the lack of pressure. Some clawed at the walls as their lungs collapsed. The weird part is that Rascher meticulously documented everything. He recorded how long it took for unconsciousness to set in, usually around 4 minutes. He noted the convulsions that followed, the way victims' faces turned blue, and the foam that poured from their mouths. Over 200 prisoners went through these chambers. Most never came out alive. But wait, it gets worse. Some experiments involved rapid decompression, basically explosive decompression that tore people apart from the inside. Rascher wanted to know if pilots could survive sudden cabin failure. The answer was usually no, but he kept testing anyway. Bodies were dissected immediately after death to examine what the pressure changes did to internal organs. The survivors faced something almost as brutal. Those who lived through the initial oxygen starvation often suffered permanent brain damage. Their coordination was shot. Memory problems plagued them for life. Some couldn't speak properly anymore. Yet these broken men were often thrown back into the chambers for repeat experiments. Then there was the question of rescue and revival. Rascher didn't just want to know how people died. He wanted to know how to bring them back. So he'd let subjects reach the brink of death, then rapidly restore normal pressure to see if they could be saved. Most of the time, the damage was already done. Hearts had stopped, brains had been without oxygen too long. The revival attempts usually failed, but not before causing additional agony. What made this even more twisted was the supposed scientific rigor. Rascher published papers on his findings. He presented data at medical conferences. Other Nazi doctors reviewed his work and suggested improvements to his methodology. They treated human suffering like a research project, complete with charts and graphs documenting death rates under different conditions. The practical results were actually useful for aviation medicine, which created an ethical nightmare that lasted long after the war ended. The data helped design better pressure suits and oxygen systems for high-altitude flight. Rescue procedures for downed pilots improved because of what was learned about oxygen deprivation. The knowledge gained from these horrific experiments genuinely saved lives later. This posed an impossible question for post-war society. Should medical knowledge gained through torture and murder ever be used to help people? Some argued that using the data would honor the victims by making their deaths serve a purpose. Others insisted that any use of this information would legitimize the crimes and encourage future atrocities. The debate raged for decades in medical journals and ethics committees. Modern aviation medicine still grapples with this legacy. Every time a pilot survives a high-altitude emergency, there's a shadow question about whether Nazi research contributed to that survival. The uncomfortable truth is that evil can produce useful knowledge, but at what cost to our humanity? Well, Rascher himself met a fitting end. Heinrich Himmler had him arrested in 1944 for personal corruption and fraud. The man who had killed hundreds in the name of science died in Dachau, the same camp where he'd conducted his experiments. There's a dark irony there that even his fellow Nazis found his behavior unacceptable, though for entirely different reasons. The pressure chamber experiments represent one of the clearest examples of how war pushed scientific boundaries past any reasonable limit. The pursuit of military advantage overrode basic human decency, leaving a stain on medical research that persists today. But high-altitude survival wasn't the only area where Nazi doctors crossed every ethical line imaginable. At that very same camp, another set of experiments was already underway, one involving tiny insects that carried death in their bite. The high-altitude experiments were just the beginning of what happened behind those barbed wire fences. While prisoners were still recovering from pressure chamber tests, Nazi doctors had already moved on to their next twisted project. This time, they weren't interested in thin air or pilot survival. They wanted to tackle one of the biggest killers plaguing German troops fighting in tropical regions: malaria. Picture this scenario. You're a Nazi commander in 1942, and your forces are getting decimated not by enemy bullets, but by tiny mosquitoes carrying deadly parasites. Soldiers are dropping like flies from fever and chills in North Africa and other warm climates. The military desperately needed solutions, and they needed them fast. But here's where things get really dark. Instead of conducting proper medical research, they decided to use concentration camp prisoners as human test subjects. The setup was disturbingly simple. Doctors at Dachau built special rooms where they could control every variable. Then they brought in cages full of malaria-infected mosquitoes. Yes, you heard that right. Cages of disease-carrying insects, ready to bite and infect whoever was unfortunate enough to be locked in those rooms. Prisoners had no choice in the matter. They were told they were being moved to different barracks or work assignments. Instead, they found themselves stripped and placed in chambers with hundreds of hungry infected mosquitoes. The insects would swarm over their exposed skin, biting repeatedly until the doctors were satisfied that enough parasites had been transmitted. But wait, it gets worse. Once the prisoners developed full-blown malaria, which usually took about 2 weeks, the real experimentation began. Nazi doctors tested various synthetic drugs at doses that would make modern physicians cringe. They weren't concerned about safety protocols or proper dosing. They wanted results, regardless of how many people died in the process. The mortality rate was staggering. More than half of the test subjects never made it out of those chambers alive. Think about that for a second. A coin flip determined whether you lived or died, all in the name of military medical research. Those who survived often wished they hadn't, as many suffered permanent damage to their organs, nervous systems and mental health. Dr. Klaus Schilling, the lead researcher on this project, kept meticulous records of everything. His notes described symptoms in cold, clinical language that completely ignored the human suffering involved. Prisoners experienced high fevers that lasted for days, violent shaking fits, hallucinations and organ failure. Some begged for death rather than endure another round of experimental drug treatments. The irony here is twisted beyond belief. While Nazi ideology claimed certain races were inferior, their entire medical research program depended on the assumption that human biology worked the same way across all ethnic groups. Otherwise, why would treatments tested on Jewish, Polish or Russian prisoners be relevant for German soldiers? Several different antimalarial drugs were tested during these experiments. Some were completely new synthetic compounds that had never been tried on humans before. Others were existing medications pushed to dangerous dose levels to see if higher concentrations might work better. The prisoners became unwilling guinea pigs for pharmaceutical research that should have taken years of careful animal testing and gradual human trials. What makes this even more disturbing is that effective malaria treatments already existed at the time. Quinine had been used successfully for centuries, and other military forces were managing tropical diseases without resorting to such extreme human experimentation. The Nazi approach wasn't about necessity, it was about taking shortcuts through human suffering. Records show that some prisoners were infected with malaria multiple times to test different drug combinations. Their immune systems were deliberately weakened to see how various treatments performed under worst-case conditions. Many subjects developed chronic malaria that plagued them for the rest of their shortened lives. Dr. Schilling's team also experimented with different strains of malaria parasites to see which ones might be most useful for biological warfare research. They weren't just trying to cure the disease. They were also exploring ways to weaponize it against enemy populations. This dual-purpose research made the experiments even more sinister than they initially appeared. The data collected from these horrific experiments did contribute to some medical advances after the war. Modern antimalarial drugs trace some of their development back to information gathered at Dachau and other concentration camps. This creates an uncomfortable ethical dilemma that medical researchers still debate today. Should scientific knowledge gained through torture and murder ever be used to benefit humanity? When Allied forces liberated Dachau in 1945, they found Dr. Schilling's detailed records documenting every aspect of the malaria experiments. The evidence was so overwhelming that he was quickly identified as a war criminal. But his research was just one piece of a much larger puzzle of medical horrors that would soon be uncovered. The malaria experiments revealed something crucial about Nazi medical research. They weren't limited to just one type of deadly disease. As investigators dug deeper into the concentration camp medical records, they discovered that infectious diseases of all kinds had been systematically tested on prisoners. The malaria mosquitoes weren't done buzzing around German concentration camps. While prisoners still suffered from tropical disease experiments, Nazi doctors moved on to their next medical target, epidemic jaundice, what we know today as viral hepatitis. This wasn't some random choice either. German troops fighting in North Africa and Eastern Europe kept getting sick with this liver-attacking virus. Soldiers would turn yellow, lose their appetite, and become too weak to fight. The Wehrmacht needed answers fast. But here's where it gets twisted. Instead of using volunteers or testing on animals first, Nazi physicians went straight to human subjects. Prisoners at Dachau, Buchenwald, and other camps became unwilling participants in hepatitis research that would span nearly 4 years. The setup was brutally simple. Doctors collected blood and other bodily fluids from soldiers already infected with hepatitis. Then they injected this contaminated material directly into healthy prisoners. No consent forms, no explanation of risks, just needles filled with a virus that could destroy liver function. Dr. Erwin Dingschuler led many of these trials at Buchenwald. His team wanted to track how the disease spread through different injection methods. Some prisoners got hepatitis through blood transfusions. Others received injections of infected serum. A few unlucky subjects were force-fed contaminated food and water. The symptoms hit fast and hard. Prisoners developed severe fatigue within days. Their skin turned a sickly yellow color as their livers struggled to process toxins. Many couldn't keep food down. Some experienced intense abdominal pain that left them curled up on cell floors. What made these experiments particularly cruel was the follow-up testing. Once prisoners showed signs of hepatitis, doctors would draw blood samples every few days. They wanted to track antibody levels and viral progression. Sick prisoners were kept in isolation blocks where medical staff could monitor their deterioration. The death rate varied depending on which strain of hepatitis was used. Hepatitis A typically caused less severe illness, though malnutritioned prisoners often couldn't recover. Hepatitis B proved far more lethal. Around 40% of subjects infected with certain viral strains died within weeks. Then there's the vaccine testing phase, which somehow managed to be even worse. German researchers knew that some people developed immunity after surviving hepatitis infections. They wondered if they could create artificial immunity through controlled exposure. This led to horrific challenge studies where prisoners were given experimental vaccines then deliberately infected with live virus to test protection levels. Most of these early vaccines were completely ineffective. Subjects got the pain of multiple injections plus a potentially fatal disease. The weird part is that some of this research actually advanced medical knowledge. Nazi doctors documented different hepatitis strains with unusual precision. They tracked incubation periods, antibody responses, and transmission methods that helped scientists understand the virus better after the war. Allied forces discovered detailed hepatitis research files when they liberated the camps in 1945. The documentation was so thorough that some findings influenced early vaccine development in the 1950s and 1960s. Medical ethicists still debate whether this tainted knowledge should have been used at all. Let's not forget the human cost behind those clinical notes. Prisoners subjected to hepatitis experiments faced months of suffering, even if they survived. Many developed chronic liver problems that lasted for decades. Others experienced recurring fatigue and digestive issues for the rest of their lives. The scale of these trials was staggering too. Historical records suggest that over 1,200 prisoners were infected with various forms of hepatitis across multiple concentration camps. That's more subjects than most modern vaccine trials use, except these people never volunteered. German military doctors justified the experiments by claiming they were saving soldier lives. If they could develop hepatitis vaccines or treatments, fewer troops would be sidelined by liver disease. The ends justified the means in their twisted logic. American military investigators later discovered that much of the hepatitis research was coordinated with university medical departments. Professors from respected German institutions provided scientific oversight and helped analyze results. The collaboration between academic medicine and concentration camp experiments shocked Allied prosecutors. Some Nazi doctors tried destroying hepatitis research files as Allied forces approached in early 1945. They knew the experiments violated every principle of medical ethics, but enough documentation survived to provide evidence at the Nuremberg trials. Dr. Dingschuler himself never faced justice. He committed suicide in his cell before trial proceedings began. Other physicians involved in hepatitis experiments received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. The hepatitis trials continued right up until Germany's surrender in May 1945. Even as the war was clearly lost, Nazi doctors kept injecting prisoners with infected material. Their obsession with military medical research overrode any remaining humanity. While German doctors were turning concentration camps into viral testing grounds, American researchers were pursuing their own wartime science projects. The Office of Scientific Research and Development had been quietly coordinating some equally strange experiments across the United States since 1941. While Nazi doctors were injecting prisoners with hepatitis and watching them die, American scientists were having their own wild party. But theirs came with government funding, fancy laboratories, and something the Germans definitely lacked: actual ethical oversight. Well, sort of. Enter the Office of Scientific Research and Development, or OSRD for short. Created in June 1941, this wasn't just another boring government agency. This was America's secret weapon factory, run by some of the smartest people on the planet. The genius behind it all, Vannevar Bush, an engineer who convinced President Roosevelt that science could win wars faster than bullets. Bush had a simple pitch: give me the best minds in America, unlimited funding, and complete secrecy. Then watch what happens. Roosevelt loved the idea. Within months, the OSRD became the most powerful scientific organization in human history. They coordinated research across every military branch, every major university, and every corporate laboratory that mattered. But here's where it gets interesting. The OSRD didn't just focus on bigger bombs or better planes, they went completely sideways with their thinking. Psychological weapons, sure, let's try it. Exploding everyday objects, why not? Death rays that could vaporize enemy aircraft, absolutely worth investigating. These scientists were basically given permission to explore every crazy idea that popped into their heads. The organization employed over 6,000 scientists directly. Thousands more worked on OSRD projects without even knowing it. MIT became their unofficial headquarters. Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford turned into military research centers overnight. Corporate giants like Bell Labs, General Electric, and DuPont started taking orders from guys in lab coats instead of business suits. What made the OSRD different from Nazi experiments was their approach to human testing. They actually asked for volunteers most of the time. Revolutionary concept, right? American soldiers would sign up to test new medicines, try experimental equipment, or participate in psychological studies. The catch: nobody told them exactly what they were signing up for. Then there's the money situation. The OSRD burned through cash like a teenager with their parents' credit card. By 1945, they were spending over $500 million annually. That's roughly $7 billion in today's money. Every wild experiment, every failed prototype, every brilliant breakthrough got funded without question. Congress just kept writing checks. The real magic happened in their coordination efforts. Before the OSRD, military branches barely talked to each other. The Army would develop a new radio while the Navy created a completely different system for the same purpose. The OSRD forced everyone to share information. Suddenly, breakthrough discoveries in one laboratory would appear in every other lab within weeks. Their most famous success: penicillin mass production. When the war started, penicillin existed only in tiny laboratory quantities. The OSRD figured out how to manufacture it by the gallon. They saved more lives with this one achievement than most entire medical programs combined. But that was just their warm-up act. Radar development accelerated under their guidance too. British scientists had created basic radar systems, but the OSRD made them compact, portable, and devastatingly effective. American radar could detect enemy aircraft from incredible distances and guide bombers through thick clouds straight to their targets. The weird part is how they balanced serious science with absolutely bonkers ideas. One week they're developing life-saving antibiotics. The next week they're designing balloons shaped like demons to scare Japanese soldiers. Both projects got equal attention and funding because nobody knew which crazy idea might actually work. Their psychological warfare division produced some truly bizarre concepts. They studied everything from enemy superstitions to color preferences in propaganda materials. American scientists spent months figuring out which shade of red would make Japanese soldiers feel most uncomfortable. Makes sense, right? Communication between Allied nations flowed through OSRD channels constantly. British discoveries reached American laboratories within days. Canadian research projects got American funding and personnel. The entire Allied scientific community started working like one massive coordinated brain. By 1943, the OSRD was running over 200 separate research programs simultaneously. Each program spawned dozens of sub-projects. Some focused on medicine, others on weapons, still others on completely theoretical concepts that wouldn't become practical for decades. They were essentially building the entire technological foundation for the modern world. Their influence extended far beyond military applications. OSRD research created new materials, improved manufacturing processes and developed technologies that would later revolutionize civilian life. Television, computers, jet engines and countless medical devices all trace their development back to OSRD laboratories. The organization's true genius lay in recognizing that winning the war required more than just bigger guns. They needed better medicine to keep soldiers alive. They needed psychological weapons to break enemy morale. They needed revolutionary new concepts that nobody had ever tried before. But some of their most ambitious projects pushed ethical boundaries in ways that would make people extremely uncomfortable today. Project Fantasia represents just one example of how far American scientists were willing to go in their quest to defeat the enemy through pure psychological manipulation. The OSRD wasn't just cooking up radar and penicillin in their secret labs. They had some truly bizarre ideas brewing behind closed doors. One of the strangest, Project Fantasia, a psychological warfare scheme that sounds like something out of a comic book. Here's the wild part. American scientists seriously believed they could terrorize Japanese troops using, wait for it, glowing demon balloons. Not kidding. The plan involved launching specially designed balloons shaped like dragons, devils and other supernatural creatures over enemy positions. These weren't your average birthday party decorations either. The balloons were painted with special luminescent materials that would glow eerily in the dark. But that wasn't enough for the creative minds at OSRD. They wanted these floating nightmares to put on a real show. Engineers rigged them with small fireworks and explosive charges designed to create flashing lights and scary sounds as they drifted over Japanese camps. The genius behind this plan: cultural psychology. American researchers had studied Japanese folklore and discovered deep-rooted fears of supernatural beings. Dragons and demons held serious meaning in Japanese culture, not the fun fantasy kind but genuine sources of dread and superstition. The scientists figured if they could tap into these primal fears they might break enemy morale without firing a single bullet. Testing became quite the spectacle. Military engineers spent months perfecting the balloon designs, experimenting with different shapes and sizes. Some looked like traditional Western demons with horns and wings. Others resembled Japanese mythological creatures, serpentine dragons with glowing eyes and flowing tails. The paint mixtures alone took dozens of trials to get right. Too dim, and the effect would be useless. Too bright, and enemy forces might shoot them down before the psychological impact hit. Then there was the self-destruct mechanism. This detail shows just how seriously they took the project. Each balloon contained a timer system designed to explode the entire contraption exactly 15 minutes after deployment. Why 15 minutes? That gave enough time for maximum terror effect while preventing the enemy from capturing the technology and figuring out American secrets. The fireworks component required serious engineering skill. Small charges were positioned throughout each balloon to create random flashing patterns. Red lights for demonic eyes, white flashes to simulate lightning. Some balloons even carried tiny speakers playing recorded sounds, ghostly wails and supernatural screams that would echo across enemy camps in the dead of night. Field tests happened in remote desert locations where curious civilians wouldn't interfere. Military observers reported that even American soldiers found the glowing balloons genuinely creepy when they first saw them floating silently through the darkness. The psychological effect seemed real enough on their own troops. Imagine what it might do to exhausted, homesick enemy soldiers already stressed by combat. But Project Fantasia faced practical problems that fancy psychology couldn't solve. Wind patterns proved unpredictable. Balloons designed to drift over specific targets often ended up miles off course, terrorizing empty jungle or friendly forces instead. Weather conditions affected the luminescent paints, sometimes making the balloons barely visible when cloud cover blocked ambient light. Manufacturing costs started piling up too. Each balloon required specialized materials that weren't exactly cheap during wartime. The luminescent paint alone cost more than standard ammunition. Military accountants began questioning whether scaring enemies was worth the expense when bullets did the job more reliably. The self-destruct timers created their own headaches. Early versions sometimes malfunctioned, exploding balloons prematurely or failing to detonate at all. Premature explosions wasted entire test runs. Failed explosions left evidence scattered across test sites, defeating the secrecy purpose. Despite months of development and testing, Project Fantasia never saw actual combat deployment. Military commanders ultimately decided the concept was too unreliable for serious warfare. Weather, wind, and technical failures made the balloon weapons unpredictable at best. Traditional psychological warfare methods, propaganda leaflets, and radio broadcasts proved more effective and infinitely cheaper. The project files remained classified for decades after the war ended. When details finally emerged, historians found hundreds of pages documenting balloon designs, paint formulas, and psychological impact studies. The sheer amount of scientific effort devoted to floating demon balloons shows how desperate wartime researchers were to find any advantage over enemy forces. What happened to all those prototype demon balloons? Most were destroyed during testing or scrapped when the project ended. A few supposedly survived in military storage facilities, though their current location remains unknown. Somewhere in a government warehouse, glowing dragon balloons might still be waiting for their moment to terrorize unsuspecting enemies. The OSRD wasn't done with unusual weapon concepts though. While demon balloons gathered dust, other scientists were working on explosive devices disguised as everyday household items. Their next brilliant idea involved something even more common than balloons, something every building in occupied territory desperately needed. Picture an ordinary light bulb sitting in your bedroom lamp. Now imagine that same innocent-looking bulb packed with enough explosive power to seriously ruin someone's day. Welcome to one of America's stranger wartime ventures, Project Blackout, where household lighting became potential weapons of war. The year was 1943, and American scientists were desperately searching for ways to help Chinese resistance fighters sabotage Japanese occupying forces. Traditional explosives were too bulky, too obvious, and frankly too hard to smuggle into enemy-controlled territory. But what if the weapon could hide in plain sight? What if it could sit on a desk, glowing peacefully, until some unsuspecting Japanese officer flicked the wrong switch? The Office of Scientific Research and Development jumped on this idea like kids on Christmas morning. Their engineers started cramming explosive materials into standard light bulbs, creating what looked like perfectly normal household items. The concept seemed brilliant on paper. Chinese operatives could replace regular bulbs in Japanese headquarters, barracks, or command centers. When enemy soldiers turned on the lights, boom, instant chaos, instant casualties, instant psychological warfare. Well, the reality proved far less spectacular than the dreams. Testing began at a secure facility in Maryland, where researchers discovered their first major problem. The explosive charge had to be small enough to fit inside a light bulb without making it obviously heavier or different looking. This constraint meant the blast radius was pathetically tiny. We're talking 2 to 3 feet maximum. Your average hand grenade has a casualty radius of about 15 feet. These exploding bulbs could barely damage someone standing right next to the lamp, but the scientists weren't ready to give up. They experimented with different chemical mixtures, trying to maximize the flash and bang within their size limitations. Some versions produced brilliant white light, designed to temporarily blind anyone in the room. Others focused on creating loud, startling explosions meant to cause panic rather than physical harm. The idea was that even a small blast could create enough confusion for resistance fighters to gain tactical advantages. The fragmentation patterns told another disappointing story. Regular light bulbs, when they explode, send glass shards flying in random directions. The researchers tried to control this spray, making it more deadly and predictable. They tested different glass thicknesses, various explosive placements, and even experimented with adding metal fragments to increase lethality. Nothing worked quite right. The glass pieces were either too small to cause serious injury, or too large to travel any meaningful distance. Then came the reliability issues. Light bulbs weren't designed to be bombs, shocking absolutely no one except apparently the people funding this project. The explosive charges had to survive normal handling, shipping and installation without accidentally detonating. They needed to activate only when electrical current flowed through the filament, but remain stable under temperature changes, humidity, and the rough treatment typical in wartime conditions. Many test bulbs either failed to explode when switched on, or went off at completely random times. The timing mechanism proved equally troublesome. Engineers wanted the bulbs to explode within seconds of being turned on, giving targets no chance to react or escape. But they also needed enough delay to avoid killing the resistance operatives installing them. Finding this sweet spot required dozens of iterations and countless failed prototypes. Some bulbs exploded immediately upon receiving power, while others took so long that suspicious Japanese officers might notice something wrong and evacuate the area. Field testing revealed even more problems. The bulbs had to look authentic under close inspection, which meant matching the exact appearance, weight, and even the sound of standard Japanese lighting equipment. American bulbs used different socket types, voltage requirements, and manufacturing marks than their Japanese counterparts. Creating convincing forgeries required detailed intelligence about enemy electrical systems and access to genuine Japanese bulbs for comparison. Manufacturing costs quickly spiraled out of control. Each explosive bulb required hand assembly by skilled technicians, specialized chemicals that were already in short supply for other weapons programs, and extensive quality control testing. The military could produce thousands of regular grenades or bombs for the cost of a few dozen light bulb weapons. By late 1943, Project Blackout was quietly shelved. The explosive bulbs simply couldn't deliver enough destructive power to justify their complexity and expense. The tiny blast radius meant they were more likely to startle enemy soldiers than actually harm them. The unreliable timing mechanisms made them as dangerous to friendly forces as to the enemy. And the manufacturing challenges meant they could never be produced in quantities large enough to make a strategic difference. The project's failure taught valuable lessons about weapon design and covert operations. Sometimes the most creative ideas simply don't translate into practical military applications, but those same creative minds were already working on their next wild scheme. Speaking of wild schemes, wait until you hear about the death ray proposals that had Winston Churchill himself scratching his head in bewilderment. While most nations focused on conventional weapons, a handful of inventors claimed they could build something straight out of science fiction: death rays. These weren't your typical movie props either. We're talking about serious proposals backed by scientific theories and pitched to the highest levels of government. The concept was surprisingly simple in theory. Scientists believed they could create focused beams of energy that would vibrate molecules in enemy aircraft until the metal structure literally fell apart. Imagine pointing a device at a bomber squadron and watching them crumble mid-flight. The range? Miles and miles away from the target. Harry Grindell Matthews became Britain's most famous death ray evangelist. This Welsh inventor had already made a name for himself with various gadgets, but his diabolical ray caught everyone's attention in the early 1940s. Matthews claimed his device could stop airplane engines at considerable distances by disrupting their electrical systems. The British Air Ministry was skeptical but curious enough to investigate. Then there's the American angle. Multiple inventors across the United States bombarded military offices with death ray blueprints. Some proposed using concentrated radio waves, others suggested particle beams, and a few even claimed they could harness atomic energy for their weapons. The enthusiasm was infectious, even if the science was questionable. Winston Churchill himself received several death ray proposals during his time as Prime Minister. Picture the man dealing with Nazi bombers overhead, and suddenly someone walks in claiming they've solved the entire air war problem with a single invention. Churchill, being both pragmatic and curious about new technology, actually ordered investigations into the most promising designs. The British government established secret committees to evaluate these claims. Scientists would review the proposals, sometimes even meeting with the inventors directly. Most meetings ended with polite rejections, but the research continued because nobody wanted to miss the next game-changing weapon. What made these proposals particularly intriguing was the backing science. Molecular vibration was a real phenomenon that scientists understood reasonably well. Heat a piece of metal enough, and its molecules vibrate so intensely that the structure weakens. The challenge was creating focused energy beams powerful enough to achieve this effect at long distances. American researchers at various universities actually built small-scale prototypes. These devices could indeed generate focused energy beams, and some could even affect metal objects at short ranges. A few contraptions managed to heat metal plates or disrupt simple electrical circuits from several feet away. Progress was measurable, even if it fell far short of the grand promises. The military applications seemed endless if the technology could be scaled up. Anti-aircraft defenses would become obsolete overnight. Naval battles could be decided by whichever side had the most powerful ray projectors. Ground troops might carry portable versions to disable enemy vehicles. British scientists built their own experimental devices, often working in converted barns or abandoned warehouses. Security was tight because nobody wanted enemy spies learning about potential death ray technology. Some projects received code names like Project Moonbeam or Operation Lighthouse, though the actual research was far more mundane than these dramatic titles suggested. The fundamental problem was power. Creating focused energy beams required enormous amounts of electricity, far more than any portable generator could provide. Early prototypes needed massive power plants just to operate for a few minutes. Even then, the effective range remained disappointingly short. Range limitations plagued every design. While inventors promised mile-long destruction capabilities, actual devices struggled to affect targets beyond a few hundred yards. Aircraft traveling at high speeds would zip through any beam's effective zone before taking meaningful damage. The physics simply didn't support the grand claims. Military officials remained cautiously optimistic despite repeated failures. The potential advantages were too significant to abandon completely. Secret funding continued flowing to the most promising research teams throughout the war. Small breakthroughs kept hope alive that major advances might be just around the corner. Some inventors became increasingly desperate as their devices failed to meet expectations. A few resorted to staged demonstrations using pre-weakened targets or hidden conventional explosives. These deceptions were usually discovered quickly, but they highlight how much pressure researchers felt to produce results. The Americans and British shared some death ray research through their wartime alliance, though both nations kept their most sensitive projects classified. Neither side wanted to reveal their full capabilities or limitations to anyone, even close allies. Testing accidents were surprisingly common given the experimental nature of the equipment. High-voltage electrical systems caused several fires and injured numerous researchers. One British facility suffered a complete power grid failure that knocked out electricity to an entire town for 3 days. Real-world applications proved elusive despite years of intensive research. None of the death ray projects produced weapons suitable for actual combat use. The technology remained firmly in the experimental phase when the war ended in 1945. But these wild experiments didn't just vanish into history books. The research laid groundwork for technologies that would reshape warfare in completely unexpected ways, though not quite in the manner anyone originally envisioned. Death rays might sound like pure fantasy, but the US Navy had real problems to solve. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. Traditional methods weren't cutting it. Something new was needed. Enter the underwater flare experiments off the New Jersey coast in 1943. The idea seemed straightforward enough. Drop powerful flares into the ocean from Navy blimps. Light up enemy submarines hiding beneath the surface. Then blast them to pieces. Simple, right? Well, not exactly. The Navy brass loved the concept on paper. Blimps could patrol vast areas without the fuel limitations of regular aircraft. They could hover in place, drop flares systematically, and coordinate attacks with surface vessels. But testing this underwater illumination system would prove far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. Lieutenant Commander James Hartwell led the experimental team. His background in underwater photography made him perfect for the job, or so his superiors believed. The truth was, nobody really understood what would happen when you ignited magnesium-based flares beneath 20 feet of seawater. The chemistry alone was questionable. Navy blimps launched from Lakehurst Naval Air Station carrying crews of 6 to 8 men. Each blimp carried experimental flare canisters weighing nearly 40 pounds each. These weren't your typical emergency flares. Engineers had packed them with concentrated magnesium, phosphorus compounds and experimental chemicals designed to burn underwater for extended periods. The first few test runs went smoothly enough. Flares dropped into the Atlantic, ignited properly, and created impressive underwater light shows. Researchers could photograph the illumination patterns from above. The light penetrated surprisingly deep, theoretically enough to expose a submarine's silhouette against the ocean floor. But then came the night of October 15, 1943. Blimp K-47 was conducting its third flare drop of the evening when something went catastrophically wrong. The flare canister exploded prematurely, still inside the gondola. Magnesium fire spread instantly through the enclosed space. 3 scientists and 2 sailors died within minutes. Their bodies burned beyond recognition. The surviving crew members faced an impossible choice: stay with the burning aircraft or jump into the frigid Atlantic Ocean at night. 2 men chose to jump. Only one survived the fall and subsequent rescue operation. Navy investigators spent weeks trying to understand what had gone wrong. The flare's timing mechanism had malfunctioned. But why? Was it the altitude, the temperature, some unknown chemical reaction triggered by the ocean environment? Nobody could say for certain. Despite the tragedy, the experiments continued. Military pressure was too intense to abandon the project completely. U-boat attacks were still claiming dozens of Allied vessels every month. Any potential solution had to be explored, regardless of the risks involved. Modifications were made to the flare design. New safety protocols were implemented. Crew sizes were reduced to minimize casualties if another accident occurred. The Navy even considered using unmanned balloons instead of crewed blimps, but the technology wasn't sophisticated enough for precise flare placement. Results from the later tests were mixed at best. The flares did illuminate underwater areas effectively, but photographing submarines at night remained nearly impossible. Camera technology of the 1940s simply couldn't capture useful images in those conditions. Radio communication between blimps and surface vessels was unreliable. Coordination proved frustratingly difficult. The weird part is how the flares affected marine life. Fish would swarm toward the underwater lights in massive numbers, creating confusing shadows that looked exactly like submarine periscopes or hull sections. Researchers spent hours analyzing photographs of fish schools, thinking they'd discovered enemy vessels. Weather conditions off New Jersey made everything worse. Winter storms grounded the blimps for weeks at a time. When they could fly, ocean swells made accurate flare placement almost impossible. The whole operation became a logistical nightmare. By early 1944, the underwater flare project was quietly shelved. Too many accidents, too few results, and too many resources needed elsewhere. The Navy had bigger priorities as D-Day preparations intensified. But the research wasn't completely wasted. Data from these experiments influenced later naval detection technology. Scientists learned valuable lessons about underwater illumination, blimp operations, and maritime photography. Some of the chemical compounds developed for the flares found their way into post-war emergency equipment. The surviving crew members rarely talked about their experiences. Most transferred to different assignments as quickly as possible. Lieutenant Commander Hartwell himself requested a desk job in Washington, far from any experimental aircraft. Naval records from these experiments remained classified for decades. Families of the men who died weren't told the full story until the 1970s. Official reports blamed equipment malfunctions during routine training exercises. The truth was far more complex and dangerous. While American researchers were learning hard lessons about underwater warfare off the New Jersey coast, their colleagues were achieving remarkable breakthroughs in an entirely different field. Medical advances were about to change warfare forever, starting with a moldy discovery that would save more lives than any experimental flare could ever hope to protect. While Nazi doctors were busy torturing prisoners in the name of medical research, the Allies were quietly achieving something far more remarkable. They were saving lives on an unprecedented scale. The hero of this story, a simple mold that had been sitting in a London laboratory for over a decade, largely ignored. Penicillin wasn't new by the time World War II started. Alexander Fleming had discovered it back in 1928, when he noticed something odd about a contaminated bacterial culture in his lab. A bit of mold had killed the bacteria around it. Fascinating, sure, but nobody could figure out how to make enough of the stuff to actually help people. It was like discovering fire but only being able to light one match. Then the war changed everything. By 1940, wounded soldiers were dying from infections that should have been survivable. A minor cut could turn into gangrene. A simple bullet wound often meant death, not from blood loss, but from the bacteria that invaded afterward. Military doctors were desperate. They needed something, anything, that could fight infection better than the sulfur drugs they were already using. That's when Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain at Oxford University decided to take another look at Fleming's forgotten mold. But here's the crazy part. They almost gave up before they started. The amount of penicillin they could produce was microscopic. Their first successful test used urine from patients who had taken penicillin. Because the drug was so precious, they literally recycled it from people's pee. The breakthrough came in 1941, when the British government realized they had a potential wonder drug on their hands. Problem was, Britain was being bombed daily and didn't have the industrial capacity to mass produce anything, let alone grow massive amounts of temperamental mold. They needed help from their friends across the Atlantic. Enter the Americans, who approached this challenge like they approached everything else during the war: go big or go home. The US Department of Agriculture got involved, which might seem weird until you realize that growing penicillin was essentially a farming problem. They needed to find the right conditions to grow tons of the stuff. Scientists tried everything. They tested different molds from around the world. One of the most productive strains actually came from a moldy cantaloupe found at a market in Peoria, Illinois. Talk about finding treasure in unexpected places. This particular mold produced 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original sample. But growing the mold was just the beginning. The real challenge was scaling up production from tiny laboratory flasks to massive industrial tanks. Chemical companies like Pfizer, Merck and Abbott jumped in, treating this like the Manhattan Project of medicine. They were essentially learning how to brew beer, except instead of alcohol they were after life-saving antibiotics. The first major production facility used 14,000-liter tanks. Imagine swimming pools filled with carefully controlled mold cultures. The process was incredibly delicate. Temperature had to be perfect. Oxygen levels needed constant monitoring. One wrong move and weeks of work would be ruined. By early 1943, they were producing enough penicillin to treat severely wounded soldiers. The results were nothing short of miraculous. Soldiers who would have died from infected wounds were walking out of hospitals weeks later. The death rate from bacterial infections dropped by over 80% in some military hospitals. The timing couldn't have been better. The Allies were planning D-Day, which everyone knew would result in massive casualties. Military planners stockpiled penicillin like it was ammunition, because in many ways it was just as valuable. On June 6, 1944, when thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, medics had enough penicillin to treat the wounded. What made this even more remarkable was the coordination between countries. British researchers shared their knowledge freely with American manufacturers. There were no patents or trade secrets slowing things down. Everyone understood that saving Allied lives was more important than making money. The numbers tell the story best. In 1943, Allied forces had enough penicillin to treat about 100 patients. By 1945, they were producing enough to treat 40,000 patients every month. That's not just impressive manufacturing, that's tens of thousands of lives saved. Military doctors quickly learned that penicillin worked best when given early and in large doses. They developed protocols that are still used today. The drug was so effective that soldiers started calling it the magic bullet, though medics preferred the more technical term that miracle mold stuff. The war ended, but penicillin's story was just beginning. Pharmaceutical companies had figured out how to mass produce antibiotics, and they weren't about to stop. But while the Allies were busy saving lives with moldy cantaloupe extract, German scientists were taking a very different approach to wartime innovation. Their rocket program was reaching for the stars, literally, though their methods for getting there would shock the world. While American scientists were perfecting penicillin to save lives, German engineers were building something entirely different, something that would kill thousands and accidentally kickstart humanity's journey to the stars. The V2 rocket became both a weapon of terror and mankind's first ticket beyond Earth's atmosphere. Wernher von Braun didn't start his career planning to bomb London. The young rocket enthusiast just wanted to reach space. But when Nazi Germany needed long-range weapons, von Braun's childhood dreams suddenly became very useful to very dangerous people. Makes sense from their perspective, right? They couldn't bomb Britain with regular planes anymore, so why not shoot rockets at them instead? The V2 stood 46 feet tall and weighed over 13 tons when fully loaded. This wasn't some backyard firecracker. The thing burned liquid oxygen and ethyl alcohol, reaching speeds of 3,500 miles per hour. That's faster than a rifle bullet. When it worked properly, which wasn't always guaranteed, the rocket could carry a 1-ton warhead nearly 200 miles. But here's the weird part. Every successful V2 launch technically made history twice. Once as an act of war, and once as a space mission. These rockets climbed over 60 miles high during flight, officially crossing the boundary into space. Neil Armstrong was still a teenager when German weapons were already touching the cosmos. The first combat V2 hit London on September 8, 1944. No warning sirens could help, because the rocket traveled faster than sound. Londoners heard the explosion first, then the whooshing noise of its approach afterward. Talk about doing things backwards. Over the next 8 months, more than 3,000 V2Cs were launched at Allied targets. London took the worst of it, with over 500 rockets hitting the city. Then there were the production costs. Each V2 required the same amount of resources as building a fighter plane. Germany was throwing away aircraft worth of materials for weapons that couldn't even be reused. Meanwhile, their air force was running out of planes. Strategic thinking clearly wasn't their strong suit toward the war's end. The human cost of building these rockets often gets overlooked. Concentration camp prisoners and foreign workers assembled V2Cs in underground factories under horrific conditions. More people died building the rockets than were killed by them in combat. Around 20,000 workers died during production, while the weapons themselves killed roughly 9,000 people. Those numbers should make anyone uncomfortable. Von Braun later claimed he focused purely on the technical challenges and ignored the weapon's purpose. Whether you believe that depends on how much you think brilliant engineers can compartmentalize their consciences. The man definitely knew where his rockets were headed and what they carried. Despite the destruction, V2 technology represented a genuine breakthrough. Liquid-fueled rockets had never been built at this scale before. The guidance systems, fuel injection methods, and aerodynamic designs were revolutionary. Every space program that followed borrowed heavily from German innovations, even if nobody wanted to admit it publicly. American forces raced to capture V2 technology as Germany collapsed. Operation Paperclip would soon bring von Braun and hundreds of other German scientists to the United States. The rockets that terrorized London would eventually help put Americans on the moon. History loves its ironic twists. The V2's accuracy was terrible by modern missile standards. Landing within 11 miles of the target counted as a success. But accuracy wasn't really the point. These were terror weapons designed to break civilian morale and force Britain out of the war. Psychological impact mattered more than military precision. Soviet forces captured the main V2 production facility and hauled everything back to Russia. Stalin wasn't about to let the Americans monopolize rocket technology. Within a few years, both superpowers were building improved versions of German designs and pointing them at each other. What makes the V2 story particularly strange is how quickly it shifted from nightmare to dream. The same basic technology that brought death from the sky became humanity's path to exploring other worlds. Von Braun's team eventually built the Saturn V rocket that powered the Apollo missions. Same principles, completely different purpose. The technical lessons learned from V2 failures proved just as valuable as the successes. Early rockets exploded, veered off course, or simply refused to ignite. Each failure taught engineers something new about fuel mixtures, metal stress, or guidance systems. Space exploration required mastering all these problems first. Modern GPS satellites, weather forecasting, and international communications all trace their origins back to rocket technology pioneered during World War II. Every smartphone depends on satellites that exist, because German engineers figured out how to make rockets work reliably. While von Braun's team was accidentally launching the space age from European battlefields, Japanese scientists on the other side of the world were conducting experiments that would horrify even seasoned military researchers. Their biological warfare program made rocket development look almost innocent by comparison. Deep in the mountains of Manchuria, China, something truly horrific was happening. While the world focused on Hitler's camps in Europe, Japan was running its own nightmare program. Unit 731 wasn't just another military research facility. It was a biological weapons laboratory that made Nazi experiments look tame by comparison. The Japanese called their test subjects logs, not people, not prisoners, logs. This dehumanizing language made it easier for researchers to do the unthinkable. Over 10,000 human beings would die in these experiments between 1937 and 1945. The facility sprawled across 6 square kilometers and employed over 3,000 people, including some of Japan's most brilliant scientists. What made Unit 731 particularly twisted was its scale and sophistication. Led by Lieutenant General Shuro Ishihi, the program didn't just test biological weapons on individuals, they tested them on entire populations. Plague-infected fleas were dropped from aircraft over Chinese villages. Cholera bacteria contaminated water supplies. Anthrax spores were released into the air. The results? Hundreds of thousands of civilians died from these biological attacks. But the laboratory work was where things got really dark. Prisoners were infected with diseases while fully conscious. No anesthesia. Researchers wanted to observe the natural progression of illness, so they couldn't risk dulling the subjects' responses. Plague, cholera, smallpox, botulism, and other pathogens were injected directly into healthy people. Then came the waiting and watching. The weird part: some experiments had nothing to do with biological weapons at all. Japanese doctors performed live dissections on prisoners to study human anatomy. They called it special treatment. Prisoners had limbs amputated and reattached to different parts of their bodies. Others were subjected to extreme temperatures to study frostbite, then had their frozen limbs smashed with hammers to see how the tissue reacted. Then there were the pressure experiments. Subjects were placed in vacuum chambers until their eyes popped out of their skulls. Air was injected into their bloodstreams to study embolisms. Women were raped and infected with syphilis to study the disease's progression during pregnancy. Children weren't spared either. Infants were infected with various pathogens to test age-related immunity responses. Unit 731's research extended beyond the main facility too. Sub-units across Japanese-occupied territory conducted their own experiments. Unit 100 focused on animal diseases that could destroy enemy livestock and crops. Unit 516 tested chemical weapons. The network was vast and coordinated, sharing data and techniques across the empire. Makes sense that they'd want to keep this secret, right? Well, here's where it gets complicated. After Japan surrendered, the United States discovered Unit 731's research. Instead of prosecuting the scientists for war crimes, American officials made a deal. The biological warfare data would be handed over to the US military in exchange for immunity from prosecution. General Douglas MacArthur personally approved this arrangement. The reasoning: the Soviet Union was already becoming America's next enemy, and this biological weapons research was too valuable to lose to war crimes tribunals. Shiro Ishii and his team walked free. They never faced justice for their crimes. But the knowledge they provided did advance medical science in some unexpected ways. Research on frostbite helped develop better treatment protocols for hypothermia victims. Studies on disease progression contributed to vaccine development. Data on human tolerance to biological agents informed public health responses to natural outbreaks. The ethical questions surrounding this knowledge remain controversial to this day. What's particularly disturbing is how normal these scientists seemed after the war. Many returned to prestigious positions at Japanese universities and hospitals. Ishii himself became a successful businessman. Some even received honors for their contributions to medicine. The cognitive dissonance is staggering when you consider what they'd done just years earlier. The scale of Unit 731's operations dwarfed similar programs run by other nations. While Germany's medical experiments were horrific, they were typically conducted on smaller groups in concentration camps. Unit 731 had industrial-scale facilities designed specifically for human experimentation. They even had their own railway line to transport subjects and supplies. Documentation of these experiments was extensive but largely destroyed as Soviet forces approached in 1945. However, enough evidence survived to piece together the program's scope. Survivor testimonies, captured documents and post-war investigations revealed the systematic nature of these atrocities. The biological weapons developed at Unit 731 were never used against American forces, partly because Japan feared retaliation in kind. However, they were extensively deployed against Chinese populations throughout the war. Conservative estimates suggest these biological attacks killed at least 580,000 people. While Unit 731 represents one of history's darkest chapters in military science, it wasn't the only program pushing ethical boundaries during the war. Back in Nazi Germany, another series of experiments was subjecting prisoners to deadly cold in the name of improving pilot survival rates. While Japanese researchers in Unit 731 were busy with their biological horrors in Manchuria, German scientists had their own twisted version of medical research happening simultaneously. These weren't your typical lab experiments with test tubes and microscopes. They involved human beings submerged in ice water until their body temperature dropped to deadly levels. The Nazi freeze experiments began with a simple military problem. German pilots shot down over the North Sea or Arctic waters were dying from hypothermia before rescue teams could reach them. Luftwaffe commanders needed data. How long could a human survive in freezing water? What happened to the body during extreme cold exposure? Could they develop better survival techniques? Dr. Sigmund Rasche led these studies at Dachau concentration camp. His approach was brutally direct. Prisoners were stripped naked and forced into tanks filled with ice water. The temperature, around 36 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold enough to kill you, slowly and painfully. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Rasha didn't just throw people into ice baths and wait. He measured everything: heart rate, breathing patterns, body temperature, brain activity. Some victims were forced to wear full Luftwaffe flight suits to test their effectiveness. Others went in completely naked to establish baseline data. The experiments typically lasted between 1 to 5 hours. Most subjects lost consciousness within the first hour. Their body temperatures dropped to around 79 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, most humans die. Yet the research continued even after unconsciousness set in. What did they discover? Well, the human body fights hypothermia in predictable stages. First comes violent shivering as your muscles try to generate heat. Then your blood vessels constrict, pulling warmth away from your extremities to protect vital organs. Your heart rate slows dramatically. Eventually you slip into unconsciousness as your brain shuts down non-essential functions. Some prisoners were pulled out just before death to test rewarming techniques. The results were mixed and often fatal anyway. Rapid rewarming caused shock that killed many subjects. Gradual warming took too long for battlefield conditions. Rasha tried everything from hot baths to body heat from other prisoners. Then there were the high-altitude experiments that went hand in hand with the freezing studies. Prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers that simulated flying at 40,000 feet without oxygen. The goal? Understanding what happened to pilots who bailed out at extreme altitudes. The symptoms were horrific. Subjects experienced rapid decompression, oxygen starvation, and severe pain as gases in their bodies expanded. Many died within minutes. Their lungs ruptured, blood vessels burst, and organs failed catastrophically. Rasha documented every detail with clinical precision. Around 200 prisoners died directly from these experiments. Hundreds more suffered permanent damage from frostbite, organ failure, and brain injuries caused by oxygen deprivation. The survivors faced a lifetime of health problems that would never fully heal. The weird part is that some of this research actually worked. German flight suits improved based on data from the freezing experiments. Survival times for downed pilots increased slightly. Rescue procedures became more effective in certain situations. It's disturbing to admit, but real knowledge came from these horrific studies. After the war, Allied investigators found detailed records of every experiment. Rasha had kept meticulous notes, photographs, and temperature charts. His scientific methodology was sound, even though his subjects were murdered in the process. This created a massive ethical dilemma that haunts medical research to this day. Dr. Rasha met his own end before the war finished. Heinrich Himmler had him executed in 1945, not for his crimes against humanity, but for falsifying some experimental data and personal corruption. Even the SS had standards, apparently, though they were completely twisted ones. The data from these experiments sparked heated debates in medical communities for decades. Should research obtained through torture and murder ever be used? Some argued the information could save lives. Others insisted using it would validate the original crimes. Most medical institutions eventually agreed to ban any reference to Nazi experimental data. Modern survival medicine owes nothing to these experiments, despite what some people claim. Ethical research conducted after the war provided far better information about hypothermia treatment and high-altitude survival. Turns out you don't need to murder people to understand how cold affects the human body. The Nuremberg trials addressed these medical experiments directly. The Nuremberg Code established basic principles for human experimentation that still guide medical research today. Voluntary consent, minimal risk, and the right to withdraw became fundamental requirements for any legitimate study. Yet even as these German freeze experiments were ending, British scientists were developing revolutionary technology that would change warfare forever. Their work with radar and electronic systems happened in laboratories, not concentration camps, and would prove far more decisive than any torture-based research. While Nazi scientists froze prisoners and Japanese researchers spread plague, Britain was quietly revolutionizing warfare in a completely different way. They weren't torturing people in labs or dropping biological weapons from planes. Instead, they were bouncing invisible waves off enemy aircraft and completely changing how wars would be fought forever. The chain-home radar system became Britain's electronic eyes in the sky. Picture a network of towering metal structures dotted along the English coast, each one sending out radio pulses and listening for echoes. When German bombers approached, these stations could detect them from over 100 miles away. The technology was so new that many military leaders didn't even understand how it worked. But here's the weird part. The system was incredibly primitive by today's standards. Operators had to manually plot aircraft positions on large tables using colored blocks, like some massive board game where the stakes were life and death. The equipment was so temperamental that a flock of birds could sometimes trigger false alarms. Yet this crude technology gave Britain a crucial advantage during the Battle of Britain. German pilots couldn't figure out why British fighters always seemed to know exactly where they were coming from. The Luftwaffe expected to achieve surprise attacks, but RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes were already climbing to intercept them before they crossed the English Channel. What should have been easy bombing runs turned into deadly aerial battles where the British held all the cards. Then there's the countermeasures war that followed. Once Germany realized Britain had radar, they started developing ways to fool it. The most famous trick was called window. Millions of thin aluminum foil strips dropped from aircraft to create false echoes on radar screens. Each strip was cut to exactly half the wavelength of British radar frequencies. When dropped in massive clouds, these strips made German bombers appear to multiply like magic on radar displays. The first window mission over Hamburg in 1943 completely overwhelmed German air defenses. Their radar operators watched in confusion as what appeared to be thousands of aircraft filled their screens. The real bombers slipped through almost unopposed, devastating the city. German night fighter pilots flew in circles, chasing ghosts made of metal foil. Well, Britain wasn't about to let Germany have all the electronic warfare fun. British scientists developed their own radar jamming equipment and began what they called spoof raids, sending small groups of aircraft equipped with powerful transmitters to mimic large bomber formations. German fighters would scramble to intercept these phantom fleets while real British bombers attacked completely different targets. Electronic warfare became an invisible chess match played at the speed of light. Each side developed new radar frequencies, and the other side built jammers to counter them. German submarines used radar detectors to spot British aircraft, so British engineers created radar that operated on frequencies the Germans couldn't detect. When Germany finally caught up, Britain switched frequencies again. The technology race produced some genuinely bizarre weapons. British engineers built transmitters so powerful they could actually burn out German radar receivers from miles away. They called it electronic bombing, destroying enemy equipment without dropping a single explosive. German electronics would simply fry like overloaded light bulbs when hit by these focused radio beams. Makes sense that both sides started using radar for more than just detection. British bombers got their own radar systems for navigation and target finding. The H-2S radar could map cities from above, showing rivers, coastlines and major buildings even through thick clouds. Bomber crews could finally attack precise targets at night instead of just dropping bombs somewhere over Germany and hoping for the best. German U-boats learned this lesson the hard way. British aircraft started carrying radar sets that could spot submarine periscopes and conning towers from several miles away. Submarines that had ruled the Atlantic suddenly found themselves hunted by planes they couldn't see or hear until bombs were already falling. The electronic advantage shifted the entire Battle of the Atlantic, and the weird part is how primitive some of the solutions were. When German radar started detecting British bombers too effectively, British engineers simply wrapped aircraft engines in special materials that absorbed radar waves instead of reflecting them. They were basically inventing stealth technology using 1940s materials and techniques. The psychological impact was just as important as the technical advantages. German pilots reported feeling like they were being watched by invisible eyes. British bombers seemed to appear from nowhere, strike precisely and vanish before defenders could respond. The electronic warfare created an atmosphere of technological terror that went far beyond the physical damage. British radar operators became the unsung heroes of the war. These men and women sat in darkened rooms, staring at glowing screens covered in green dots, making split-second decisions that determined whether cities lived or died. Their ability to distinguish between friendly and enemy aircraft, often using nothing but the timing and pattern of radar echoes, required skills that hadn't existed before the war. But electronic warfare was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. While Britain mastered the invisible battlefield of radio waves, other nations were pushing human endurance to its absolute limits in ways that would shock the world. While other nations focused on fancy gadgets and chemical weapons, the Soviet Union took a brutally direct approach to military science. They wanted to know exactly what the human body could handle before it broke completely. Their experiments didn't involve high-tech equipment or complex laboratory setups. Instead, they threw soldiers into the worst conditions imaginable and carefully documented what happened next. The Soviets faced a unique problem during the war. German forces had pushed deep into Russian territory, forcing millions of soldiers to fight through harsh winters with limited supplies. Traditional military training couldn't prepare troops for the extreme conditions they encountered. How long could a soldier march without food? What happened to decision-making abilities after days without sleep? How did the mind react when body temperature dropped dangerously low? Soviet researchers decided to find out through controlled experiments. They selected groups of soldiers and subjected them to starvation conditions for weeks at a time. These weren't volunteers in the traditional sense. Military orders meant participation wasn't optional. Scientists carefully measured how physical deterioration affected combat performance, reaction times, and ability to follow complex commands. The starvation trials revealed disturbing patterns. After just 5 days without adequate food, soldiers began experiencing vivid hallucinations. Some reported seeing enemy troops that weren't there. Others claimed to hear artillery fire during complete silence. By day 10, many subjects couldn't distinguish between reality and their minds' desperate attempts to cope with extreme stress. Well, it gets stranger. Researchers discovered that starving soldiers often became obsessed with detailed food fantasies. They would spend hours describing elaborate meals, sometimes becoming violent when interrupted. One documented case involved a soldier who attacked a researcher for interrupting his imaginary dinner with his family. The man genuinely believed he was eating his mother's cooking instead of lying in a freezing research facility. Cold exposure experiments proved equally brutal. Scientists placed soldiers in outdoor enclosures during Russian winter, monitoring how long they could maintain basic military functions. Body temperature, heart rate, and cognitive abilities were tracked minute by minute. Some subjects were given minimal clothing, while others received standard winter gear for comparison. The results shocked even hardened Soviet military officials. Soldiers in inadequate clothing began losing motor control within 30 minutes of exposure. Their speech became slurred, and simple tasks like loading ammunition became impossible. But the truly disturbing discovery was how cold affected judgment. Hypothermic soldiers consistently made terrible tactical decisions, often exposing themselves to imaginary threats while ignoring real dangers. Then there were the sleep deprivation studies. Researchers kept soldiers awake for up to 2 weeks using various methods to prevent rest. Bright lights, loud noises, and physical activity rotations ensured subjects couldn't sleep even for minutes. The goal was understanding how exhausted troops would perform during extended battles. After 72 hours without sleep, soldiers began experiencing micro-sleeps while standing upright. They would literally fall asleep for seconds at a time without realizing it. By day 7, most subjects couldn't form coherent sentences or remember basic instructions. Some developed temporary psychosis, becoming convinced that researchers were enemy spies trying to extract military secrets. And the weird part is, these experiments actually produced useful military intelligence. Soviet commanders learned that rotating troops every 3 days prevented most psychological breakdown. They developed new field rations specifically designed to maintain mental clarity during food shortages. Winter warfare tactics were completely restructured based on cold exposure data. The research also led to improved equipment design. Soviet engineers created better insulated boots, more effective field kitchens, and portable shelters that could be assembled by exhausted soldiers. These innovations saved thousands of lives during the brutal Eastern Front campaigns. Let's not forget the psychological components of these trials. Researchers noted that soldiers from rural backgrounds consistently outperformed urban recruits in starvation conditions. Farm-raised subjects seemed better adapted to irregular meals and physical hardship. This discovery influenced Soviet recruitment strategies for specialized units. Some experiments focused on group dynamics under extreme stress. How did military hierarchy change when everyone was starving? Scientists observed that traditional command structures often collapsed after prolonged deprivation. Soldiers began following whoever seemed most mentally stable, regardless of official rank. The most disturbing findings involved what researchers called survival cannibalism psychology. They documented exactly how starving groups made decisions about sharing remaining food or abandoning weakened members. These studies remained classified for decades, but influenced Soviet military doctrine about unit cohesion during desperate situations. Makes sense, right? If you're going to send millions of soldiers into the worst conditions on Earth, you need to know exactly what those conditions will do to them. The Soviet approach was horrifically practical in its cold calculation. But while the Soviets were pushing human endurance to its absolute limits, Nazi Germany was conducting equally disturbing experiments with a different focus. Their scientists weren't content with studying what the human body could survive, they wanted to rebuild it entirely. After studying how bodies respond to freezing temperatures and deadly diseases, Nazi doctors turned their attention to something equally disturbing. They wanted to rebuild human bodies like machines. Bones, muscles, nerves, everything could be replaced, right? Well, that twisted logic drove some of the most horrific medical experiments of the entire war. The concept seemed almost reasonable at first glance. German soldiers were losing limbs and suffering severe nerve damage on multiple fronts. Traditional medicine couldn't fix a shattered femur or restore function to a severed nerve. But what if doctors could transplant healthy bones from one person to another? What if they could graft muscle tissue or reconnect damaged nerves using parts from prisoners? Dr. Karl Gebhardt led many of these experiments at Ravensbrück concentration camp. This guy convinced himself he was advancing surgical science. He performed bone transplants by removing sections of healthy leg bones from prisoners and attempting to graft them into other subjects. The procedures were barbaric beyond description. No anesthesia, no sterile conditions, no consent, obviously. The bone experiments focused primarily on the fibula, that smaller bone running alongside your shin. Doctors would cut it out of one prisoner and try to transplant it into another who had artificial fractures created specifically for the experiment. Makes your skin crawl, doesn't it? They literally broke healthy bones just to practice fixing them with stolen parts from other victims. Muscle regeneration experiments were equally brutal. German doctors believed they could restore damaged muscle tissue by transplanting healthy sections from prisoners. They would remove chunks of muscle from the legs, arms and backs of victims, then attempt to graft this tissue onto other subjects. The procedures failed spectacularly most of the time. Infections spread rapidly through the surgical sites. Gangrene set in within days. But here's where it gets even more twisted. These doctors kept detailed records of everything. They photographed the procedures. They measured healing times. They documented which subjects died and when. All in the name of advancing medical knowledge for the German war effort. Nerve regeneration experiments pushed the boundaries of human cruelty even further. The human nervous system is incredibly complex, and severed nerves rarely heal properly on their own. German doctors thought they could solve this problem by harvesting nerve tissue from prisoners and transplanting it into soldiers with combat injuries. The procedures were nightmarish. Doctors would expose long sections of nerves in prisoners' arms and legs, then cut them out entirely. These nerve sections would be grafted into other subjects who had artificially created nerve damage. The victims experienced excruciating pain throughout the entire process. Many developed permanent paralysis. Others died from infections that spread along the damaged nerve pathways. Dr. Gebhardt genuinely believed his research would revolutionize battlefield medicine. He presented his findings to other Nazi medical officials, claiming significant advances in surgical techniques. The reality was far different. Success rates remained dismally low. Most transplant attempts resulted in rejection, infection, or death. Then there were the combination experiments. Some prisoners endured multiple procedures, having bones, muscles and nerves harvested or transplanted in sequence. These subjects became living laboratories for testing various surgical approaches. The psychological trauma was immense, but Nazi doctors showed zero concern for their victims' mental state. The infections were particularly devastating. Without modern antibiotics or proper surgical facilities, even minor procedures often turned fatal. Prisoners developed sepsis, tetanus, and various bacterial infections that spread throughout their systems. The concentration camp environment made recovery virtually impossible. Surprisingly, some of this research did contribute to legitimate medical advances decades later. Modern orthopedic surgery, plastic surgery, and neurosurgery incorporated certain techniques that originated from these experiments. The ethical implications remain deeply troubling, but the medical knowledge gained couldn't simply be ignored. Recovery rates for the experimental subjects were abysmal. Most died within weeks of their procedures. Those who survived often lived with permanent disabilities, chronic pain, and psychological trauma that lasted for decades. The lucky ones died quickly from infections or complications. Documentation from these experiments provided crucial evidence during the Nuremberg trials after the war ended. Dr. Gebhardt and several colleagues were convicted of war crimes and executed for their role in these medical atrocities. Their detailed records became proof of systematic medical abuse conducted under the guise of scientific research. The psychological impact on survivors extended far beyond physical injuries. Many developed severe trauma responses that modern psychiatrists would recognize as complex PTSD. The betrayal of medical trust, having doctors inflict harm rather than provide healing, created lasting psychological wounds. Modern medical ethics standards emerged partly as a response to these Nazi experiments. The Nuremberg Code established principles requiring informed consent, minimizing harm, and ensuring potential benefits outweigh risks. Medical schools now teach these ethical guidelines as fundamental requirements for any human research. While German doctors were busy transplanting bones and grafting muscles in concentration camps, other nations were developing their own questionable weapons programs. Some of these involved deadly gases that would make the bone experiments seem almost tame by comparison. After all those experiments on human endurance and surgical procedures, military scientists turned their attention to something even more terrifying: poison gas. The weapon that had haunted World War I battlefields was back, but this time researchers wanted to make it deadlier, more precise, and understand exactly how much damage it could inflict on the human body. Here's where things get really dark. The United States, Britain, and Germany all ran secret programs testing lethal gases on living subjects. Small groups of people were locked in sealed chambers while various chemical compounds were pumped in. The goal: figure out the perfect dose to disable enemy troops without killing your own soldiers when the wind changed direction. Mustard gas became the star of these experiments. This yellowish compound had a nasty reputation from the previous war, causing severe burns, blindness, and lung damage that could last for years. But military scientists wanted detailed data. How long did it take to work? What concentration caused temporary disability versus permanent damage? Could you create a version that worked faster? The testing process was methodical and brutal. Subjects were exposed to carefully measured amounts of gas while doctors recorded symptoms minute by minute. Skin blistering started within hours. Respiratory damage followed quickly after. The worst part: many test subjects had no idea what they were breathing until the effects kicked in. Britain's chemical warfare program operated out of Porton Down, a facility that would remain active for decades. Researchers there tested not just mustard gas but dozens of other compounds. Some caused violent coughing fits. Others induced temporary blindness. A few experimental gases could apparently make enemy soldiers vomit so severely they'd be unable to fight for days. Then there's the American program, which recruited volunteers from military bases across the country. Soldiers were promised extra pay and told they'd be helping test protective equipment. Many thought they'd just be trying on new gas masks. Instead, they found themselves in sealed rooms breathing experimental chemicals while scientists took notes from behind thick glass windows. The German program took a different approach entirely. They focused on developing gases that could penetrate existing Allied protective gear. Their chemists worked around the clock creating compounds that could seep through rubber seals or overwhelm standard filters. Some of these experimental weapons were so toxic that even the German researchers handling them required special protective suits. What made these experiments particularly disturbing was the attention to detail. Scientists didn't just want to know if their gases worked, they wanted to understand exactly how they worked. They measured how quickly chemicals absorbed through skin. They timed how long it took for lung tissue to break down. They even studied whether certain blood types showed different reactions to the same compounds. But here's something interesting that emerged from all this horror. The protective equipment developed during these trials actually saved lives. Gas masks improved dramatically once researchers understood exactly what they needed to filter out. New rubber compounds could resist chemical penetration for hours instead of minutes. Decontamination procedures became more effective when scientists knew precisely how different gases bonded to fabric and skin. The data from these experiments also led to some unexpected medical breakthroughs. Doctors learned new treatments for chemical burns and respiratory damage. They developed antidotes that could counteract certain types of poisoning. Emergency response procedures improved when medical teams understood the timeline of chemical weapon effects. Not all the experimental gases made it to the battlefield. Thankfully, many proved too unpredictable or difficult to manufacture in large quantities. Others worked well in laboratory conditions but failed when tested outdoors where wind and weather could disperse them unpredictably. Some experimental compounds were so dangerous that even the armies developing them decided they were too risky to deploy. The ethical implications of this research would haunt the scientific community for generations. Unlike other wartime experiments that at least claimed to help friendly forces, poison gas testing existed purely to cause suffering to enemy troops. There was no medical benefit, no defensive purpose, just finding better ways to hurt people. International law eventually caught up with these weapons. The Geneva Convention would later ban many of the compounds developed during World War II, but the knowledge gained from these experiments didn't disappear. It influenced chemical safety protocols, industrial accident response, and even modern terrorism preparedness. The protective gear developed during these trials became standard equipment for military forces worldwide. Those improved gas masks and decontamination procedures probably prevented more casualties than the weapons themselves ever caused in actual combat. While soldiers were choking on experimental gases in sealed chambers, other military scientists were working on a completely different kind of warfare. Instead of attacking enemy bodies, they wanted to attack enemy minds. The next phase of wartime experimentation would focus on breaking down psychological defenses and turning propaganda into a precision weapon that could demoralize entire armies without firing a single shot. While soldiers fought with bullets and bombs, another kind of war was happening behind the scenes. This one targeted something much more fragile than bodies: the human mind. The Allies discovered that breaking enemy morale could be just as effective as breaking their supply lines, maybe even more so. What's the point of having weapons if your soldiers are too demoralized to use them? Psychological warfare became a science during World War II. Not just throwing around random propaganda, but carefully tested methods designed to crawl inside enemy heads and mess with their thinking. The results were both brilliant and disturbing. The Office of Strategic Services kicked things off with leaflet experiments. But here's the twist. They didn't just print random messages and hope for the best. They ran actual scientific tests to figure out what worked. Different colors got tested first. Researchers discovered that yellow paper caught attention better than white in daylight conditions. Red made people think of danger and blood, which sometimes backfired when trying to encourage surrender. Blue seemed calmer but got ignored in battlefield conditions. The winning combination: black text on white paper with a thin red border, simple but backed by data from thousands of field tests. Then came the language experiments. Scientists worked with linguists to craft messages that would hit psychological pressure points. They tested formal military language versus casual slang. Turns out messages written in everyday speech worked better because they felt more personal and believable. One particularly clever test involved fake surrender instructions. Researchers created multiple versions of the same message encouraging German soldiers to give up. Version A used threatening language about inevitable defeat. Version B promised good treatment as prisoners. Version C mixed both approaches. They dropped equal quantities of each type over similar German positions and tracked surrender rates. Version B won by a landslide. Soldiers responded better to promises than threats, which sounds obvious now but wasn't proven back then. This discovery shaped Allied propaganda for the rest of the war. Radio broadcasts became another testing ground. The Allies created fake German radio stations that broadcast realistic-sounding news mixed with demoralizing information. But they had to be careful. If the fake news was too obviously false, it would backfire and actually boost enemy morale. So they ran experiments on timing and content. Small lies mixed with verifiable truths worked better than big obvious lies. Broadcasting at specific times when real German radio was off the air made the fake stations seem more legitimate. They even tested different German accents to see which ones sounded most trustworthy to enemy soldiers. The weirdest part, they brought in German prisoners of war to help test the effectiveness of their own psychological weapons. These prisoners, already captured, would listen to propaganda broadcasts and rate how convincing they sounded. Many actually helped improve the messages, either because they genuinely switched sides or figured cooperation might improve their treatment. British intelligence took things further with Operation Black, a program that created entirely fake German newspapers. These weren't obviously Allied propaganda. They looked and sounded genuinely German, complete with real news, weather reports and sports scores. Hidden among the legitimate content were subtle messages designed to undermine confidence in Nazi leadership. Testing revealed that completely fabricated stories got spotted too easily, but taking real events and adding subtle negative spins worked like magic. A genuine German military victory might get reported accurately, but with added comments about heavy casualties or equipment shortages. Technically true, but psychologically devastating. American researchers focused on surrender leaflets with scientific precision. They tested everything from paper thickness to message length. Thin paper got blown away by wind before soldiers could read it. Too thick, and it looked suspicious. The sweet spot was newspaper weight paper that felt familiar in soldiers' hands. Message length experiments showed that long, detailed arguments got ignored during combat stress. Short, punchy messages performed better. The optimal length? Exactly 47 words. Anything longer lost effectiveness. Anything shorter seemed too simplistic. Some tests measured the impact of including photographs. Pictures of well-fed Allied prisoners increased surrender rates by 23% compared to text-only leaflets. Images of destroyed German cities had the opposite effect. They made soldiers angry rather than demoralized, actually reducing surrender rates. One brilliant psychological experiment involved timing. Instead of dropping leaflets randomly, researchers coordinated drops with artillery barrages. Right after intense bombing, when German soldiers were already shaken and scared, leaflets would flutter down offering a way out. The timing amplified the psychological impact dramatically. Color psychology experiments revealed cultural blind spots. Red, white, and black Nazi flag colors actually increased resistance when used in Allied propaganda, but green and blue combinations, which had no political associations, made messages seem more neutral and trustworthy. These weren't just academic exercises. Every test result got applied immediately to real battlefield situations, affecting real human minds under unimaginable stress. The data collected from these psychological experiments didn't disappear when the war ended. Military strategists realized they'd stumbled onto something powerful: scientific methods for influencing human behavior on a massive scale. But that's where things get really interesting, because the next phase of wartime science involved weapons that could literally set the battlefield on fire. While scientists across the world were busy dropping leaflets and broadcasting fake news to mess with enemy minds, another group of researchers had their sights set on something far more direct and terrifying. Fire as a weapon wasn't exactly new. Humans had been burning each other's stuff for centuries. But World War II demanded something different. Something portable, precise, and absolutely devastating in close combat. The flamethrower became the answer to a very specific military problem. How do you clear out an enemy bunker when bullets just bounce off concrete? How do you force soldiers out of trenches without sending your own men into a meat grinder? Fire, it turns out, doesn't care much about cover. German engineers started the serious work first. They'd learned some harsh lessons in World War I about trench warfare, and they weren't eager to repeat the experience of sending wave after wave of soldiers into machine gun fire. Their early flamethrower designs were clunky contraptions that required multiple operators and enough fuel lines to trip over. These things weighed nearly 40 pounds when fully loaded. Try running with that strapped to your back while someone's shooting at you. But here's where it gets interesting. The real challenge wasn't building a device that could shoot fire. Any idiot with a garden hose and some gasoline could manage that. The problem was creating the right kind of fire. Regular gasoline burns too quickly and doesn't stick to anything. What they needed was something that would cling to surfaces, burn longer, and couldn't be easily extinguished. American researchers at the Chemical Warfare Service had their own ideas about fuel mixtures. They started experimenting with something called napalm, basically gasoline mixed with a thickening agent made from aluminum salts. This stuff had the consistency of syrup but burned like hell itself. The mixture would stick to whatever it hit and keep burning for several minutes. Water wouldn't put it out. Even rolling around on the ground barely helped. Testing these weapons required building elaborate mock-ups of enemy positions. Engineers constructed fake German bunkers, complete with firing slits and reinforced walls. They dug replica Japanese cave systems based on intelligence reports from the Pacific. Then they turned their flame weapons loose on these targets to see what worked and what didn't. The results were both impressive and horrifying. A single operator with a portable flamethrower could clear out positions that would have required artillery strikes or costly infantry assaults. The psychological effect was enormous too. Few soldiers wanted to stick around when liquid fire started pouring through their windows. German tests revealed some unexpected problems though. The fuel tanks made operators prime targets for enemy snipers. One well-placed shot could turn a flame trooper into a human torch. Early models had a nasty habit of backfiring, which was exactly as awful as it sounds. Engineers had to redesign the ignition systems multiple times after test subjects suffered severe burns from their own weapons. Range became another critical issue. Early flamethrowers could barely reach 30 feet, which meant operators had to get uncomfortably close to their targets. German scientists worked on pressurization systems and nozzle designs to extend that range. They discovered that a steady, concentrated stream worked better than a wide spray pattern for most tactical situations. Then there were the safety protocols for the soldiers using these weapons. Flame troops needed special training, protective gear, and backup support. They couldn't work alone, the fuel supplies were limited, and reload times left operators vulnerable. Military tacticians had to completely rethink how infantry units would coordinate when flamethrowers were involved. American tests in mock Pacific Island scenarios showed different challenges. Dense jungle vegetation could work for or against flame weapons depending on conditions. Wet foliage was nearly impossible to ignite effectively. Dry underbrush created opportunities for fires to spread beyond intended targets, potentially trapping friendly forces. The fuel supply chain created its own set of problems. These weapons consumed massive amounts of specialized fuel mixtures. Military planners had to figure out how to transport, store and distribute volatile chemicals in active combat zones. One stray shell hitting a fuel depot could create spectacular and deadly explosions. German engineers eventually developed more compact models that single operators could handle effectively. They refined ignition systems that were more reliable and less prone to dangerous malfunctions. Safety training evolved to include emergency procedures for dealing with equipment failures and accidental ignitions. Testing revealed that weather conditions dramatically affected performance. Rain, wind, and humidity all changed how the weapons functioned. Operators needed to adjust their techniques based on environmental factors, which meant more complex training programs and field manuals. These flame weapon trials established protocols that would influence military doctrine for decades. The lessons learned about specialized equipment, operator safety, and tactical deployment became standard knowledge across multiple armies. But the work on portable destruction was just getting started. Other researchers were already looking at different ways to use animals in their quest to understand the devastating effects of explosive weapons. During World War II, scientists faced a peculiar problem. They needed to understand exactly what bombs, bullets, and explosions did to living bodies. But studying wounded soldiers in the chaos of battle, nearly impossible. Their solution was both practical and disturbing. Animals became the unfortunate test subjects for military research. Rabbits, dogs, pigs, goats and even monkeys found themselves positioned at calculated distances from explosive devices. The goal wasn't cruelty for its own sake. Military doctors desperately needed data to save human lives. The experiments followed a grim routine. Researchers would place animals in protective gear they wanted to test, then detonate bombs nearby. Different species served different purposes. Pigs were chosen because their skin thickness resembled humans. Dogs were used for their size and organ placement similarities. Rabbits, their smaller bodies helped researchers understand shrapnel patterns. What makes this even more unsettling is how methodical it all became. Scientists created detailed charts showing blast distances, injury types, and survival rates. They photographed wounds, timed bleeding, and recorded how long animals remained conscious after various traumas. The British conducted extensive trials at their Porton Down facility. They positioned sheep at different distances from chemical explosions to test new protective clothing designs. American researchers did similar work in the Nevada desert, using captured German explosive devices on groups of laboratory animals. But here's where things get weird. Some experiments produced genuinely life-saving discoveries. When researchers noticed that animals wearing certain materials survived blasts better, they redesigned military helmets and body armor. Hundreds of soldiers later survived wounds that would have been fatal with older equipment. The data collection was incredibly detailed. Scientists measured everything from heart rate changes to bone fracture patterns. They tracked which injuries caused immediate death versus prolonged suffering. This information directly influenced battlefield first aid training and emergency medical procedures. Then there were the more unusual experiments. German researchers tested whether animals could detect incoming artillery shells through ground vibrations. They trained dogs to recognize specific explosion sounds and measured their stress responses. The goal was creating early warning systems for troops in trenches. American scientists went further with sensory studies. They exposed animals to flashbang explosions to understand temporary blindness and hearing loss. The results helped develop better recovery protocols for soldiers caught in surprise attacks. The psychological impact on researchers often went unrecorded. Many scientists struggled with the ethical implications of their work. Some requested transfers to other projects. Others justified their actions by focusing on the human lives their research might save. What's particularly striking is how these animal experiments influenced modern trauma medicine. Techniques for treating severe burns, controlling massive bleeding, and preventing shock all trace back to wartime animal studies. Emergency room doctors today still use protocols developed from this research. The scale of these experiments was staggering. American facilities alone used over 200,000 animals during the war years. British research consumed similar numbers. German and Soviet programs remained largely secret, but surviving documents suggest equally extensive testing. Some discoveries came from unexpected observations. Researchers noticed that animals with certain genetic traits survived explosions better than others. This led to studies on human genetic factors in trauma recovery, though that research remained classified for decades. The weapons testing revealed disturbing truths about modern warfare's effects. Conventional explosives caused predictable injury patterns, but new chemical weapons created lingering health problems that researchers had never seen before. Animals exposed to these substances developed mysterious illnesses weeks or months later. Military officials used the animal data to make strategic decisions. If certain weapons caused primarily superficial injuries, they were deemed less effective than alternatives that inflicted more serious damage. The research literally shaped which weapons got mass-produced and deployed. The documentation from these experiments filled thousands of pages. Detailed reports described optimal placement for different explosive charges, effective ranges for various weapons, and injury patterns from different attack angles. Much of this information remained classified until the 1970s. Perhaps most troubling was how routine it all became. Laboratory staff developed standardized procedures for animal handling, explosion timing, and post-blast medical evaluation. The work transformed from emergency wartime research into systematic data collection. The ethical debates these experiments sparked continue today. Modern military research still uses animal testing, but under much stricter oversight and with more humane protocols. The wartime studies established both valuable medical knowledge and controversial precedents for future research. What's undeniable is the immediate practical impact. Battlefield medics trained using techniques developed from animal explosion studies saved countless lives during major battles. The research provided concrete answers to questions that couldn't be answered any other way during wartime. But even as these animal experiments revolutionized trauma care, another branch of military science was exploring an entirely different frontier. While some researchers studied physical injuries, others were investigating how to alter human consciousness itself through chemical means. The Pacific War had ended, but American scientists weren't ready to put down their test tubes. While Operation Paperclip was busy collecting German rocket experts, another program was quietly taking shape in Maryland. Edgewood Arsenal became the epicenter of what would become one of the longest-running and most controversial chemical experiments in military history. Starting in 1948 and running until 1975, this wasn't your typical wartime research. The Cold War had begun, and military planners were obsessed with a terrifying question: what if the enemy could turn American soldiers into confused, helpless zombies? Chemical warfare had evolved beyond simple poison gas. Now scientists wanted to explore the dark corners of the human mind. Over 7,000 military personnel would eventually participate in these experiments. Most were volunteers. Though the word volunteer gets complicated when you're dealing with soldiers who might not fully understand what they're signing up for. The recruitment pitch was simple. Help your country test new protective equipment and medical treatments. Easy duty, right? Well, not exactly. The arsenal tested 254 different chemical compounds on these human subjects. Some were relatively harmless. Others were absolutely not. LSD became a star player in these experiments, years before hippies made it famous. But the military wasn't interested in peace, love, and rock music. They wanted to know if enemy agents could slip hallucinogens into water supplies or spray them from airplanes. Imagine being a 19-year-old soldier, thinking you're testing a new gas mask. Instead, you're given a dose of LSD without being told what it is. Suddenly the walls start breathing, your sergeant's face melts, and you're convinced the base is under attack by purple elephants. Not exactly what you signed up for when you enlisted. The experiments weren't limited to LSD either. Scientists tested BZ, a chemical that could cause hallucinations lasting up to 80 hours. Think about that for a moment. More than 3 days of complete psychological chaos from a single dose. Some subjects experienced terrifying delusions, believing they were being chased by invisible enemies or that their fellow soldiers had turned into monsters. Then there were the cholinesterase inhibitors, chemicals that interfered with the nervous system's ability to function normally. These could cause everything from excessive sweating and vomiting to complete respiratory failure. The military wanted to understand how these chemicals worked so they could develop both weapons and antidotes. But here's where things get really twisted. Many of these experiments happened without proper informed consent. Soldiers were told they were testing medical compounds or protective gear, not that they were guinea pigs for mind-altering drugs. Some weren't told anything at all about the true nature of what they were ingesting. The psychological effects often lasted far longer than anyone expected. Veterans reported flashbacks, nightmares, and personality changes that persisted for decades. Some developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD, not from combat, but from their own government's experiments. Family members described loved ones who came home different, more paranoid, prone to sudden mood swings, or haunted by experiences they couldn't fully explain. What makes this even more disturbing is that civilian researchers were involved too. The CIA's infamous MKUltra program overlapped with Edgewood's work. University professors, hospital doctors, and pharmaceutical companies all contributed to this massive experiment on American servicemen. What line between military research and civilian medical ethics became incredibly blurred. The testing methods were surprisingly sophisticated for their time. Scientists carefully monitored subjects' vital signs, behavior, and psychological responses. They filmed reactions, recorded conversations, and maintained detailed medical records. This wasn't sloppy science. It was methodical, thorough, and completely unethical by today's standards. Some chemicals tested at Edgewood later found their way into actual military applications. Tear gas formulations were refined based on human testing data. Protective equipment was improved after researchers saw exactly how various compounds affected breathing, vision, and motor control. The knowledge gained wasn't purely academic. It had real-world military applications. Veterans who participated in these experiments spent decades fighting for recognition and compensation. Many suffered health problems they believed were connected to their time at Edgewood, but proving causation was nearly impossible. The military's own records were often incomplete or classified, making it difficult for veterans to even document what had been done to them. The program officially ended in 1975, but its legacy continues to influence military research ethics. New regulations now require much more stringent informed consent procedures and independent oversight of human experimentation. The Edgewood veterans became a cautionary tale about what happens when national security concerns override basic human rights. These chemical experiments weren't the only medical advances happening during the war years. While Edgewood was exploring the darker aspects of military science, other researchers were making discoveries that would save countless lives on battlefields around the world. Blood was everywhere on the battlefields of World War II. Soldiers were dying not just from bullets and bombs but from something that seemed almost fixable: blood loss. The human body can survive incredible trauma, but lose too much of that red stuff flowing through your veins. Game over. Military doctors faced a brutal reality. They could patch wounds, remove shrapnel, even perform complex surgeries in makeshift field hospitals. But when a soldier's blood pressure dropped from massive hemorrhaging, there wasn't much anyone could do. Well, that was about to change in ways that would revolutionize medicine forever. The breakthrough came from understanding something surprisingly simple. Blood doesn't always have to come from the same person who's bleeding out. Sounds obvious now, right? But back then, blood transfusions were risky, complicated procedures that killed patients almost as often as they saved them. Dr. Charles Drew, an African-American surgeon, cracked the code that stumped military medical teams across multiple continents. The weird part is, he figured out that you didn't need whole blood at all. Plasma myon, the liquid part without the red cells, worked just as well for treating shock, and plasma could be stored for weeks without refrigeration. This discovery meant everything for battlefield medicine. Suddenly, you could set up blood banks right behind the front lines. Medics could grab a bottle of plasma, stick a needle in a dying soldier's arm, and watch his blood pressure stabilize within minutes. The logistics were game-changing. American and British forces started collecting blood donations on an industrial scale. Civilians back home lined up at Red Cross stations, rolling up their sleeves for soldiers they'd never meet. Makes sense, right? Your pint of blood might save 3 different wounded troops halfway around the world. But here's where it gets interesting. The military wasn't just collecting blood, they were experimenting with it. Different storage methods, various preservation techniques, new ways to type and match blood quickly in battlefield conditions. Some of these experiments pushed ethical boundaries, but the results saved thousands of lives. Then there was the challenge of getting blood products to remote locations. Pacific Island battles, North African campaigns, Siberian front operations, all places where keeping blood cold and fresh seemed impossible. Military scientists developed portable refrigeration units, insulated containers that could maintain proper temperatures for days, and rapid testing kits that worked in jungle humidity or desert heat. The British came up with mobile blood banks, literally trucks equipped with everything needed to collect, process, and distribute blood products on the move. These vehicles followed advancing troops, staying close enough to provide immediate transfusions but far enough back to avoid enemy fire. Well, most of the time anyway. Russian forces took a different approach. They trained more soldiers in basic transfusion techniques, figuring that having lots of people who could perform the procedure was better than having perfect equipment. Soviet medics learned to do blood transfusions with minimal supplies, sometimes using improvised equipment that would make modern doctors cringe. Japanese military medicine lagged behind in this area, partly because their medical doctrine emphasized preventing wounds rather than treating them after the fact. This philosophical difference cost them dearly during prolonged battles where casualty rates overwhelmed their field hospitals. German forces initially had excellent blood transfusion capabilities, but as the war dragged on and resources became scarce, their systems broke down. Late-war German field hospitals often lacked basic supplies for transfusions, forcing medics to watch soldiers die from preventable blood loss. The data coming back from these battlefield transfusion programs was incredible. Death rates from traumatic injuries dropped by over 60% in units with reliable access to blood products. Soldiers who would have died from shock in World War I were walking out of field hospitals weeks later. Some of the most important discoveries happened by accident. Medics noticed that certain blood types seemed to work better for specific types of injuries. They found that temperature affected how quickly transfused blood integrated with a patient's circulatory system. These observations led to protocols still used in emergency rooms today. By 1944, Allied forces had perfected a system that could get fresh blood products to wounded soldiers within hours of injury. The entire supply chain from civilian donors to battlefield medics operated with clockwork precision. This wasn't just medical science anymore, it was industrial-scale life-saving. The psychological impact was huge too. Soldiers fought more aggressively knowing that effective medical care waited behind the lines. Commanders planned riskier operations because they could count on getting wounded men back into fighting shape. What nobody fully realized at the time was how these wartime blood transfusion techniques would transform civilian medicine. Every major hospital today uses methods developed during World War II battlefield conditions. But while Allied forces were perfecting ways to save lives with blood transfusions, other wartime medical programs were taking a much darker turn. The same scientific curiosity that led to life-saving plasma storage also drove some researchers toward experiments that crossed every ethical line imaginable. When Nazi Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, American intelligence teams raced through bombed-out laboratories and research facilities like treasure hunters. They weren't looking for gold or artwork, they wanted something far more valuable: brains. German scientists had developed rockets that could reach space, jet engines that outperformed anything the Allies had, and medical knowledge gained through years of wartime research. The question facing American officials was simple but morally complex. Should they recruit these brilliant minds, even knowing some had worked for the Nazi regime? The answer came in the form of Operation Paperclip, one of the most controversial recruitment programs in American history. Named after the paperclips used to attach new identities to German personnel files, this secret operation would bring over 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers and technicians to the United States between 1945 and 1959. The man behind much of this effort was Major Robert Staver, who understood that America's former enemies possessed scientific knowledge that could prove crucial in the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. Wernher von Braun became the program's most famous recruit. The rocket engineer who had created the V-2 missiles that terrorized London now found himself designing rockets for NASA. His team of German engineers would eventually help put Americans on the moon. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Von Braun had used slave labor from concentration camps to build his rockets. Thousands of prisoners died in underground factories producing his weapons, yet American officials decided his expertise in rocket technology outweighed his wartime activities. The recruitment process involved some creative paperwork. To put it mildly, background checks were simplified or ignored entirely when scientists possessed particularly valuable knowledge. Files were sanitized. Nazi party memberships disappeared from official records. Some scientists received new identities and fabricated histories that painted them as reluctant participants rather than willing collaborators. American officials justified these actions by arguing that Soviet forces were conducting their own scientist recruitment program in occupied Germany. Then there were the medical researchers. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, had conducted high-altitude experiments during the war. His research on how the human body responds to extreme conditions proved invaluable for developing America's space program. Kurt Blohm, who had researched biological weapons for the Nazi regime, was recruited to work on similar projects for the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. These men brought knowledge that American scientists couldn't easily replicate through ethical means. The program extended far beyond rocket technology and medicine. German experts in aerodynamics helped design America's next generation of military aircraft. Chemical weapons specialists shared their knowledge of new compounds and delivery systems. Even seemingly mundane expertise proved valuable. German scientists had developed synthetic fuels, advanced metallurgy techniques, and electronic components that gave American industry significant advantages in the post-war economy. American officials faced constant pressure to balance moral concerns against national security needs. Some recruited scientists had relatively clean backgrounds, while others carried much heavier baggage from their wartime service. The program's directors developed an informal ranking system. The most valuable scientists received the fastest processing and best treatment regardless of their past activities. Less essential recruits faced more scrutiny and longer delays. What made Operation Paperclip particularly effective was its comprehensive approach. Americans didn't just recruit individual scientists, they brought over entire research teams, complete with their equipment, documentation, and institutional knowledge. Whole laboratories were essentially transplanted from Germany to American facilities. These preserved not just individual expertise but entire research programs that might have taken years to recreate from scratch. The program's secrecy created some bizarre situations. German scientists worked on classified American military projects while their true identities remained hidden from most government officials. Some lived under assumed names for years, creating elaborate cover stories to explain their accents and backgrounds to neighbors and colleagues. A few scientists accidentally revealed their real identities through casual conversations, forcing intelligence handlers to create new cover stories on the spot. By the 1950s, former Nazi scientists occupied key positions throughout American research institutions. They led departments at NASA, developed weapons for the Pentagon, and conducted medical research at prestigious universities. Their influence extended into areas their American colleagues might never have anticipated. German expertise in optics improved television technology, while advances in chemistry benefited everything from plastics manufacturing to pharmaceutical development. The moral implications of Operation Paperclip continue generating debate decades later. Critics argue that America compromised its values by embracing scientists who had participated in Nazi atrocities. Supporters contend that the knowledge gained helped America win the Cold War and advance human understanding in fields like space exploration and medicine. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Operation Paperclip was simultaneously a pragmatic success and a moral compromise that reflected the complex realities of the early Cold War period. But the scientist recruitment program was just one way that wartime research continued influencing post-war developments. Even as former Nazi engineers designed rockets for peaceful space exploration, other wartime innovations were being tested in entirely different contexts, like determining whether pilots could survive increasingly dangerous aircraft accidents. When most people think about crash testing, they picture modern cars smashing into concrete barriers with crash test dummies inside. Well, during World War II, the Allies took this concept and applied it to something far more dangerous and complicated: aircraft crashes. Pilots were dying not just from enemy fire, but from the crashes themselves. Even when a plane went down in friendly territory, the cockpit design often turned what should have been survivable accidents into death traps. The problem wasn't just getting shot down anymore, it was surviving the landing. Military engineers realized they needed hard data about what actually happened to human bodies during aircraft crashes. But here's the thing, you can't exactly ask pilots to volunteer for controlled crashes. That's where dummy pilots came in, but these weren't the sophisticated crash test dummies we know today. These were basically mannequins stuffed with sand and fitted with crude sensors. The testing process was both brilliant and terrifying. Engineers would deliberately crash planes at different angles and speeds to see what killed pilots most often. Was it the initial impact, the fire afterward, or something else entirely? What they discovered changed aviation forever. Pilots weren't dying from the big obvious things everyone expected. Sure, massive explosions were deadly, but most crashes weren't massive explosions. Most were hard landings, rough impacts, or planes that simply ran out of fuel and had to come down fast. The real killer was something much more subtle. Cockpit design. When planes hit the ground, pilots were being thrown forward into instrument panels or sideways into metal framework. Their own cockpits were becoming weapons against them. Then there was the harness problem. Early war pilot harnesses were designed to keep pilots in their seats during combat maneuvers, not during crashes. When planes hit the ground, these harnesses often snapped or, worse yet, held pilots in place while the cockpit collapsed around them. Engineers started running more than 100 test flights specifically designed to crash. They'd take old planes, load them with dummy pilots and send them into controlled crashes at different speeds and angles. Some crashes were nose-first dives, others were belly landings. A few were deliberately rolled sideways to simulate being shot down. Each dummy pilot was fitted with sensors that recorded the forces hitting different parts of the body. Head impacts, chest compression, leg fractures, everything was measured and recorded. The data was gruesome, but incredibly useful. What emerged from all this controlled destruction was a revolution in cockpit design. Engineers realized that cockpits needed to be designed not just for flying but for crashing. Instrument panels were redesigned with softer edges and breakaway sections. Pilot seats were reinforced and repositioned to better absorb impact forces. The harness system got a complete overhaul too. New designs allowed pilots to stay secure during flight, but would give way strategically during crashes, preventing the harness itself from becoming a death trap. Some new harnesses even included quick-release mechanisms that pilots could trigger if they had warning before impact. Recovery techniques improved dramatically as well. Before these experiments, rescue crews often made crash injuries worse by moving pilots incorrectly. The crash test data showed exactly which injuries were most common, and how to safely extract pilots from wreckage without causing additional damage. But the weird part is how much trial and error was involved. Engineers would crash a plane, examine the dummy pilot, redesign something, then crash another plane to test the fix. It was expensive, time-consuming, and sometimes the fixes made things worse before they made them better. One particularly valuable discovery came from studying belly landings. These crashes looked less dramatic than nosedives, but they were causing unexpected spinal injuries. The dummy pilots revealed that the force of sliding across rough ground was compressing spines in ways nobody had anticipated. This led to better seat cushioning and shock absorption systems. Fire was another major concern that the tests helped address. Even when pilots survived the initial crash, they often couldn't escape burning aircraft quickly enough. The experiments showed that many cockpit designs actually trapped pilots inside during emergencies. Exit procedures were redesigned, and cockpit canopies were modified to be easier to jettison or break through. American and British engineers shared their crash test data freely between their air forces. What worked for B-17 bombers often applied to British Spitfires, and vice versa. The collaboration probably saved thousands of lives as improvements spread quickly through Allied air forces. By war's end, pilot survival rates in crashes had improved dramatically. Planes were still dangerous, but the combination of better cockpit design, improved harnesses, and enhanced rescue techniques meant that more pilots were walking away from crashes that would have killed them earlier in the war. These wartime aircraft crash experiments laid the groundwork for all modern vehicle safety testing. While engineers were learning to keep pilots alive in falling planes, they were also discovering principles that would eventually make cars, trains, and even spacecraft safer for everyone. But the immediate priority was different. Keeping fighting forces mobile and supplied across dangerous waters required vehicles that could work both on land and sea. The beaches of Normandy presented a problem that kept Allied engineers awake at night. How do you get 30-ton tanks across open water and onto a hostile shore? Swimming wasn't exactly an option. Enter the DD tank, officially known as the duplex drive, but nicknamed Donald Duck by the troops who'd eventually ride them into battle. The name fit perfectly. These contraptions looked about as seaworthy as a cartoon character trying to paddle across a pond. The concept seemed simple enough on paper. Take a regular Sherman tank, wrap it in a waterproof canvas screen that inflated like a bathtub liner, and attach twin propellers to the back. Voila, instant amphibious assault vehicle. What could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a lot actually. British engineer Nicholas Straussler developed the basic design, but turning theory into reality required months of dangerous testing. The first prototypes sank faster than rocks. The canvas screens tore in rough water. Engines flooded when waves splashed over the sides. Tank crews found themselves trapped underwater in metal coffins more often than anyone cared to admit. Each failure taught valuable lessons though. Engineers learned that the flotation screen needed to extend 8 feet above the tank's hull to handle choppy seas. They discovered that special waterproofing compounds could protect engines from salt spray. The propeller system required constant adjustments to generate enough thrust without breaking apart. Testing took place in secluded British lakes and coastal areas. Crews practiced launching from landing craft, navigating through simulated obstacles, and most importantly, getting out fast if things went sideways. The escape procedures became as crucial as the driving techniques. The American version faced different challenges. US engineers modified their Sherman tanks with snorkels and waterproof seals instead of flotation screens for some missions. These wading tanks could operate in water up to 8 feet deep, but they couldn't actually swim like their British cousins. Both approaches required extensive trial and error. Tank crews became reluctant test pilots, never quite sure if their vehicle would stay afloat or become a very expensive submarine. The psychological aspect proved as challenging as the technical problems. Asking soldiers to drive tanks into the ocean required serious trust in the engineering. Development teams experimented with different materials for the flotation screens. Rubber proved too heavy. Early canvas versions ripped easily. The final design used rubberized canvas with inflatable air chambers, essentially turning each tank into a giant pool float with serious firepower. Then there was the matter of timing. The screens had to deflate quickly once the tanks reached shore, allowing the guns to rotate and fire. Crews practiced this transition repeatedly, because a tank stuck in swimming mode made an easy target for enemy artillery. Weather conditions dominated the testing phase. Calm lake waters bore no resemblance to the English Channel on a stormy day. Engineers had to determine maximum wave heights that wouldn't swamp the vehicles. They settled on waves no higher than 3 feet. Anything bigger turned the DD tanks into very dangerous carnival rides. The propeller systems caused endless headaches. Early versions broke constantly under the strain of pushing 30 tons through water. Engineers eventually developed a drive system that connected directly to the tank's engine, but the power transfer reduced the vehicle's already modest water speed to a leisurely 4 knots. Navigation presented another puzzle. Tank periscopes worked fine on land but proved nearly useless when waves splashed across the viewing ports. Special waterproof compasses and communication equipment had to be installed. Crews learned to navigate by following guide boats and staying in formation. Training accidents happened regularly during the testing phase. Tanks rolled off landing craft at the wrong angle and capsized immediately. Others made it partway to shore before their screens collapsed, sending crews scrambling for life preservers. The learning curve was steep and occasionally fatal. American engineers also experimented with completely different approaches. They developed inflatable pontoons that could be attached to regular tanks, essentially creating floating platforms. These proved more stable than the canvas screen method, but took longer to deploy and detach. The final DD tank design that hit the beaches on D-Day represented thousands of hours of testing and dozens of engineering refinements. The success rate still wasn't perfect. Many tanks sank in the rough channel waters, but enough made it ashore to provide crucial fire support for the infantry. Production teams had to manufacture these specialized vehicles in complete secrecy. Factory workers weren't told what they were building. The canvas screens were made at separate facilities from the tank modifications. Even the propeller assemblies were produced by different companies to maintain operational security. Each successful test brought the Allies closer to solving their amphibious assault puzzle. But the ocean wasn't the only environment where military equipment faced extreme survival challenges. Deep beneath the waves, submarine crews were fighting their own battles against pressure, oxygen, and the constant threat of being trapped underwater with no way out. Deep beneath the ocean's surface, World War II submarines faced a terrifying reality. When enemy depth charges found their mark, sailors didn't just worry about drowning, they faced something far more complex and deadly. The US Navy knew this problem all too well. Submarine crews were some of their most valuable assets, but they were also sitting ducks once their boats went down. Traditional rescue methods, pretty much useless at depths beyond 200 feet. The pressure would crush a man's lungs before he could swim halfway to the surface. Enter the Naval Medical Research Laboratory, where scientists began conducting some of the war's most crucial yet overlooked experiments. These weren't the flashy rocket tests or dramatic weapon trials that grabbed headlines. This was life-and-death research happening in pressure chambers, diving bells, and experimental submarines. The basic problem was simple to understand but brutal to solve. Human lungs contain roughly 6 liters of air at sea level. Dive down 33 feet, and the pressure doubles. Your lungs compress to 3 liters. At 66 feet, half that again. By the time you reach 300 feet, where many disabled submarines settled, the pressure was crushing. But here's where it gets interesting. Scientists discovered that sailors could actually survive much longer in sunken submarines than anyone expected. The trick was managing the air composition and pressure inside the boat itself. Research teams tested different breathing mixtures, adding helium to reduce nitrogen narcosis and carefully controlling oxygen levels to prevent poisoning. Dr. Albert Benke led many of these experiments at the Navy's diving research facility. His team recruited volunteer divers who spent hours in pressure chambers, simulating conditions inside damaged submarines. The volunteers breathed experimental gas mixtures while researchers monitored their heart rates, brain function, and blood chemistry. Some sessions lasted over 12 hours. The results were eye-opening. Pure oxygen, which seemed like the obvious choice for emergencies, turned deadly at high pressures. Sailors breathing pure oxygen at depths equivalent to 200 feet would suffer seizures within minutes. Mixed gases worked better, but the ratios had to be perfect. Then there was the escape problem. Even if sailors could survive inside a sunken submarine, how would they get out? The Navy tested various escape devices, including early versions of what would become modern scuba gear. Volunteers practiced emergency ascents from depths that would make your ears pop just thinking about them. One particularly clever invention was the Momsen lung, a simple breathing device that recycled exhaled air while filtering out carbon dioxide. Test subjects used these devices to escape from submarines deliberately sunk in controlled conditions. The success rate improved dramatically once they figured out the right ascent speed. Well, the ascent speed turned out to be critical. Rise too fast and nitrogen bubbles would form in the bloodstream, causing the bends. This condition could paralyze or kill a sailor even after a successful escape. Research teams carefully mapped safe ascent rates, creating tables that submarine crews memorized along with their emergency procedures. The psychological aspects proved just as important as the physical ones. Sailors trapped in a dark, flooding submarine needed to stay calm enough to follow complex escape procedures. Researchers studied stress responses under simulated emergency conditions, discovering that proper training could keep panic at bay even in seemingly hopeless situations. Some experiments pushed ethical boundaries, even by wartime standards. Volunteers were subjected to carbon dioxide poisoning to study its effects on decision-making. Others breathed increasingly toxic air mixtures to determine exactly when cognitive function would fail. The data was invaluable, but the human cost was significant. The research paid off in real combat situations. When US Tang was accidentally hit by its own torpedo in 1944, 13 crew members successfully escaped from 180 feet underwater using techniques developed in these experiments. Only 5 survived the ascent, but without the research, none would have made it. Submarine rescue technology advanced rapidly throughout the war. New escape hatches, improved breathing apparatus, and better emergency protocols saved hundreds of lives. The knowledge gained from these pressure studies also influenced the design of submarine hulls, making them more likely to maintain structural integrity when damaged. The weirdest part is how this research accidentally contributed to completely different fields. The gas mixture experiments helped develop better anesthesia for surgery. Pressure studies influenced early spacesuit design. Understanding human responses to confined spaces proved useful for aircraft cockpit layouts. By war's end, submarine survival rates had improved dramatically. Sailors still faced terrible odds when their boats went down, but they had fighting chances where none existed before. The research continued long after 1945, eventually leading to modern deep-sea rescue capabilities that can save crews from depths once considered impossible. These underwater survival studies represented wartime science at its most practical. No exotic theories or wild technological leaps, just methodical problem-solving that kept sailors alive. The next breakthrough in wartime nutrition research would prove equally practical, but in ways that transformed how armies thought about feeding their troops during extended combat operations. Submarines weren't just metal coffins waiting to sink. They represented some of the most advanced underwater technology of World War II. But here's what gets overlooked. The real challenge wasn't building these vessels. It was keeping the crew alive when things went horribly wrong. The Navy knew the statistics. When a submarine got hit, sailors had maybe minutes before the hull cracked completely. Those minutes meant everything. The difference between a rescue and a tragedy often came down to how well the crew could handle impossible pressure situations and whether their emergency equipment actually worked. Enter the most claustrophobic research program of the war. Scientists needed to understand exactly what happened to human bodies trapped in a flooding submarine. They built massive pressure chambers that could simulate the crushing depths of the ocean floor. These weren't gentle experiments either, they pushed test subjects to their absolute limits. Volunteers from the Navy spent hours inside these chambers while researchers cranked up the pressure. The goal? Figure out how long someone could survive in a damaged submarine and what kind of breathing equipment they'd need. Simple enough in theory, but the reality was brutal. At 60 feet underwater, the pressure doubles. At 120 feet, it triples. Most submarines operated much deeper than that. The human body wasn't designed for this kind of punishment, and the test subjects learned that lesson fast. Then there was the oxygen problem. Regular air becomes toxic under extreme pressure. Too much oxygen actually poisons the brain, causing seizures and hallucinations. Too little, and you pass out before you can escape. Finding that sweet spot required dozens of trials with different gas mixtures. The weirdest part? They discovered that panic killed more sailors than actual equipment failure. When trapped underwater, the natural human response is to breathe faster and move frantically. Both reactions burn through oxygen supplies incredibly quickly. The Navy realized they needed to train submariners in mental control techniques, not just mechanical procedures. Escape hatch testing became its own nightmare. Engineers built full-scale submarine sections and flooded them repeatedly. Sailors practiced emergency exits while wearing different types of breathing gear. The early designs were disasters, heavy, complicated, and prone to malfunction exactly when you needed them most. But the breakthrough came from studying how pearl divers in the Pacific had been working underwater for centuries. These divers used simple techniques that required no equipment at all, controlled breathing, specific body positions and mental preparation. The Navy started incorporating these ancient methods into modern submarine training. The pressure suits evolved rapidly during these tests. Early versions were basically diving bells that sailors wore on their heads, clunky, terrifying, and barely effective. Later models became sleeker and more reliable, but they still required extensive practice to use correctly under stress. Research teams also focused on the submarine's internal atmosphere. When a vessel gets damaged, the air inside becomes contaminated with carbon dioxide, fuel vapors, and other toxic gases. Standard gas masks weren't designed for this specific combination of poisons. Scientists had to develop specialized filters that could handle underwater emergencies. Communication systems presented another challenge. How do you coordinate a rescue when the submarine's radio is flooded and the crew is scattered throughout different compartments? The answer involved developing underwater sound signals and emergency protocols that could work even when electronic systems failed completely. Medical research played a crucial role too. Doctors discovered that sailors trapped underwater developed unique symptoms. Nitrogen narcosis caused confusion and poor decision-making. Decompression sickness hit crews who escaped too quickly. Emergency medical kits had to be redesigned for these specific underwater injuries. The data from these experiments saved hundreds of lives during actual submarine emergencies. When the US Tang got trapped after hitting its own torpedo, the crew used techniques developed in these pressure chambers. 12 men successfully escaped using the new emergency procedures and breathing equipment. What's fascinating is how this research influenced submarine design itself. Engineers realized that certain hull modifications could buy crews precious extra minutes during emergencies. Watertight compartments were redesigned. Emergency lighting systems improved. Even the location of escape hatches changed based on what the experiments revealed about human behavior under extreme stress. The psychological aspects proved just as important as the physical ones. Researchers found that crews with better underwater emergency training showed dramatically improved survival rates, not because they were stronger or braver, but because they made better decisions when panic set in. These studies continued throughout the war, constantly refining techniques and equipment. Every submarine disaster provided new data that researchers used to improve survival odds for future crews. The process was grim but necessary, learning from tragedy to prevent more tragedy. The legacy of this underwater research extended far beyond military applications. Modern deep-sea exploration, underwater construction, and even space travel borrowed techniques first developed in these wartime submarine experiments. But the immediate goal remained focused on one thing: bringing sailors home alive from the ocean's depths. However, while submarines pushed the boundaries of underwater survival, military scientists were simultaneously tackling a completely different challenge above ground, one that would determine whether armies could march at all. When American forces first landed in the steamy jungles of the Pacific Theater, they faced an enemy they hadn't planned for. It wasn't Japanese soldiers hiding in trees or kamikaze pilots diving from the sky. The real killer was invisible, carried by mosquitoes no bigger than your fingernail and lurking in every drop of stagnant water. Malaria knocked out more American troops than bullets ever did. One bite from the wrong mosquito, and a soldier went from fighting fit to burning with fever in just days. The statistics were brutal. In some Pacific units, disease casualties outnumbered combat losses by 10 to 1. Military doctors quickly realized that winning the war meant beating the bugs first. The Army Medical Research Command launched massive tropical disease research programs across multiple continents. Teams of scientists worked in makeshift labs from New Guinea to Burma, racing against time and an enemy that bred faster than they could count. But here's where it gets interesting. These researchers couldn't just sit in comfortable laboratories back home. They had to work where the diseases lived. Scientists found themselves dodging enemy fire while collecting mosquito samples and running experiments in tents that leaked during monsoon season. The malaria problem alone demanded revolutionary thinking. Quinine, the traditional treatment, came from tree bark in Japanese-controlled territories. American scientists needed alternatives, fast. They tested hundreds of synthetic compounds on volunteer soldiers who had already contracted the disease. Some volunteers took experimental drugs that turned their skin yellow. Others endured side effects that made them dizzy for weeks. Then there was dengue fever, which soldiers nicknamed breakbone fever because the joint pain felt like having your skeleton shattered from the inside. Unlike malaria, dengue had no known treatment at all. Research teams infected laboratory monkeys to study the virus, then tried everything from aspirin to experimental vaccines that sometimes worked and sometimes made patients sicker. Dysentery presented a different challenge entirely. This bacterial infection could wipe out entire platoons through dehydration and blood loss. Field researchers followed sick soldiers into latrines, collecting samples that would make most people vomit just from the smell. They needed to understand exactly which bacteria caused the worst symptoms and how to stop them quickly. The solutions that emerged were often surprisingly simple. Scientists discovered that certain sulfur drugs, originally developed for other infections, worked brilliantly against dysentery when given in the right doses. But finding those doses meant testing different amounts on sick soldiers who volunteered to try unproven medicines. Military researchers also tackled yellow fever, a viral disease that killed through liver failure. They couldn't cure it, but they developed one of the war's most successful vaccines. The catch: the vaccine itself caused serious side effects in about 1% of recipients. Military commanders had to decide whether those odds were acceptable when balanced against yellow fever's much higher death rate. What made this research especially challenging was the time pressure. Civilian medical research typically takes years or even decades. These military scientists had months to produce results before the next major offensive. They cut corners that would horrify modern medical ethics boards, but they also achieved breakthroughs that saved thousands of lives. The tropical disease teams developed rapid diagnostic tests that could identify malaria parasites in blood samples within minutes instead of hours. They created portable treatment kits that medics could carry into combat zones. Most importantly, they figured out which preventive measures actually worked in real jungle conditions. Some discoveries happened by accident. Researchers noticed that soldiers who drank certain locally brewed teas had lower rates of intestinal infections. Chemical analysis revealed that these teas contained natural compounds that killed harmful bacteria. Within months, the military was shipping similar compounds to troops across the Pacific. The success stories were remarkable. By 1944, American forces had reduced malaria casualties by over 60% compared to early war statistics. Deaths from dysentery dropped even more dramatically once effective treatments reached the front lines. Yellow fever, which had terrorized armies for centuries, essentially disappeared from American units. But the real breakthrough was understanding how tropical diseases spread in the first place. Research teams mapped mosquito breeding patterns, identified the most dangerous water sources, and developed practical prevention strategies that individual soldiers could actually follow. Knowledge became just as powerful as medicine. These wartime tropical disease programs produced medical advances that reached far beyond military applications. The synthetic malaria drugs developed for soldiers became standard treatments in civilian hospitals worldwide. Diagnostic techniques perfected in jungle labs revolutionized tropical medicine for decades afterward. Yet the human cost of this rapid research remained significant. Volunteer soldiers who tested experimental treatments sometimes suffered permanent side effects. The pressure to produce fast results meant that long-term safety testing was often impossible. While tropical diseases were being conquered in steamy jungles, military researchers back home faced a completely different challenge: creating portable medical kits that could handle any emergency a soldier might face. When bullets started flying and soldiers hit the dirt, military doctors faced a brutal reality. They had maybe 30 seconds to save a life before moving to the next wounded man. Traditional medical bags weighed 40 pounds and took precious minutes to sort through. Something had to change. Fast. The old system was a disaster waiting to happen. Picture a medic crawling through mud, under enemy fire, dragging a massive bag that caught on every rock and root. By the time he found the right supplies, his patient was often beyond help. Military brass knew they needed something revolutionary, a medical kit so simple that any soldier could use it to save his buddy's life. Enter the portable medical kit experiments of 1943. These weren't your grandmother's first aid supplies. Scientists and military doctors worked together to create the ultimate survival package, small enough to fit in a uniform pocket, but powerful enough to handle battlefield emergencies. The challenge was deciding what stayed and what got tossed out. Early prototypes were laughably bad. The first version included a tiny scalpel, surgical thread, and instructions for field surgery. Turns out asking a regular soldier to perform emergency operations while dodging machine gun fire wasn't the brightest idea. Combat isn't medical school, and soldiers needed tools they could actually use under pressure. Trial runs revealed some uncomfortable truths. When researchers staged mock battles with fake wounds, panicked soldiers often grabbed the wrong supplies. They'd reach for bandages but pull out morphine instead. The kit needed to be foolproof, literally designed for someone who couldn't think straight because explosions were going off around him. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A Navy medic suggested color coding everything. Red wrapper meant stop bleeding, green wrapper meant pain relief, blue wrapper meant infection prevention. Simple enough that even a concussed soldier could figure it out in the dark. Sometimes the best solutions are the most obvious ones. Testing got intense quickly. Researchers simulated every type of battlefield injury they could imagine: gunshot wounds, shrapnel cuts, chemical burns, broken bones. They timed how long it took untrained soldiers to apply treatment using different kit designs. Lives depended on shaving off those crucial seconds. Morphine became the star of the show. Each kit contained a small syringe, basically a tiny toothpaste tube filled with powerful painkiller. Soldiers could inject it directly through clothing without removing anything. One squeeze and the wounded man would stop screaming long enough for proper medical attention. The psychological impact was huge too. Just knowing pain relief was available kept morale up. Tourniquets proved trickier than expected. Early versions were too complicated, requiring multiple steps and precise placement. Bleeding soldiers don't have time for complicated instructions. Engineers redesigned them as simple twist and tighten devices. Even someone with one working hand could apply it effectively. Then there's the issue nobody talks about: soldiers stealing medical supplies, not for medical emergencies, but for the morphine. Military police discovered thriving black markets where combat troops traded cigarettes and food for pain medication. The final kit design included tamper-proof seals and tracking numbers to prevent abuse. Field tests happened in some pretty awful places: Pacific Islands crawling with disease, European forests thick with mud and blood. The kits had to work in tropical heat that melted everything, and Arctic cold that froze medical supplies solid. Bandages needed to stick when wet. Medications had to remain effective despite temperature swings. Surprisingly, the hardest part wasn't the medical supplies, it was the instructions. How do you explain life-saving procedures to someone who might barely read English? The solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of written directions, they used picture cards showing exactly what to do. Step-by-step illustrations that worked regardless of education level or language barriers. Weight remained a constant battle. Every ounce mattered when soldiers were already carrying rifles, ammunition, food and water. The final kit weighed just 8 ounces but could handle most battlefield medical emergencies. That meant tough choices: include more bandages or extra morphine, more antiseptic or additional tourniquets. Combat trials proved the concept worked. Death rates from treatable wounds dropped dramatically when soldiers carried these kits. The difference was especially noticeable during prolonged battles where professional medics couldn't reach everyone quickly. Buddy aid, soldiers treating each other, saved thousands of lives. Manufacturing presented its own challenges. Producing millions of these kits required precision assembly under wartime conditions. Quality control was critical because a defective tourniquet or spoiled medication meant someone died unnecessarily. Factories worked around the clock, inspecting every component multiple times. The psychological benefits surprised everyone involved. Soldiers fought more aggressively when they knew immediate medical help was available. Fear of dying slowly from untreated wounds had haunted combat troops throughout history. These kits didn't eliminate that fear, but they reduced it significantly. What started as a simple medical supply problem revolutionized battlefield care forever. But while soldiers on the front lines were saving each other with these innovative kits, military researchers were already looking ahead to peacetime applications. The lessons learned from wartime medical innovation would soon transform civilian healthcare in ways nobody expected. When World War II ended in 1945, something fascinating happened. All those crazy experiments, dangerous tests, and wild scientific projects didn't just disappear into history books, they transformed our world in ways most people never realize. Take penicillin, for example. What started as a wartime rush to save soldiers became the foundation of modern medicine. Antibiotics that we casually pick up at pharmacies today. Thank battlefield medicine from the 1940s. That simple cut on your finger that heals without infection owes its safety to desperate wartime research. The mass production techniques developed under military pressure revolutionized how we manufacture life-saving drugs. But here's where things get interesting. Radar technology, originally designed to spot enemy planes over Britain, evolved into something much bigger. Air traffic control systems use the same principles. Weather forecasting relies on radar descendants. Even the microwave oven in your kitchen traces back to radar experiments. A British engineer noticed radar waves melted a chocolate bar in his pocket, and boom, modern convenience food was born. The darker experiments left different legacies entirely. Those horrific Nazi medical trials shocked the world so deeply that they forced a complete rethinking of scientific ethics. The Nuremberg Code emerged directly from the trials of doctors who conducted those brutal experiments. Every medical study today, from testing new headache pills to cancer treatments, follows rules written because of World War II's worst abuses. Informed consent wasn't really a thing before the war, now it's absolutely mandatory. You can't test anything on anyone without their full understanding and agreement. Research review boards exist in every hospital and university because of what happened in those concentration camp laboratories. Makes you wonder how medicine operated before these protections, right? Then there's the rocket technology that terrified London residents. Those V-2 rockets that killed thousands became the foundation for space exploration. Wernher von Braun, who designed weapons of terror, later helped put Americans on the moon. The same propulsion systems that delivered death from above eventually delivered humans to the stars. Talk about a complete transformation of purpose. Operation Paperclip brought hundreds of German scientists to America after the war. Their knowledge didn't just boost the space program neither. It revolutionized everything from jet engines to computer technology. The moral complexity still causes debates today. Should war criminals get amnesty for scientific knowledge? The question haunts intelligence agencies even now. But let's not forget the everyday innovations. Those combat rations developed through extensive testing became the ancestors of modern processed foods. Freeze-drying techniques perfected for lightweight soldier meals now preserve everything from coffee to entire meals. Energy bars, athletic nutrition drinks. The science traces back to figuring out how to keep soldiers fed and energized in impossible conditions. Blood banks started as battlefield necessities. Plasma preservation techniques developed under wartime pressure now save millions of civilian lives annually. Every car accident victim, every surgery patient, every person who needs emergency transfusions benefits from research driven by military medical needs. And the weird part is how psychological warfare experiments influenced modern marketing and communication. Propaganda techniques tested on enemy populations became the foundation for advertising psychology. Political campaign strategies still use principles developed in wartime psychological operations. That advertisement that perfectly captures your attention. It might be using tactics first tested on enemy soldiers. Aircraft safety improvements came directly from those crash simulation experiments. Modern airline safety standards, ejection seats, cockpit design all traced back to wartime testing. Every safe landing owes something to researchers who deliberately crashed planes to understand what kills pilots. Submarine escape technology, developed during the war, continues saving lives. Modern rescue operations for trapped miners, collapsed building survivors, Even cave rescues use equipment and techniques pioneered in submarine laboratories. The pressure suit technology eventually enabled deep-sea exploration and spacewalks. Even nutrition science advanced dramatically. Understanding how human bodies respond to extreme stress, starvation, and environmental challenges came largely from wartime research. Modern sports medicine, wilderness survival training, and emergency medicine all build on that foundation. Some discoveries remain classified even today. Certain chemical and biological research from the 1940s sits locked in government archives. Intelligence agencies occasionally reference studies from the wartime period without providing details. What else did they discover that we still don't know about? The ethical frameworks created after the war continue evolving. Modern debates about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence research, and human enhancement all reference principles established in response to World War II's scientific horrors. Every time scientists push boundaries, someone asks, are we repeating history's mistakes? The legacy lives on in unexpected places. Computer science, materials engineering, even psychology and sociology carry DNA from wartime research programs. The urgency of war accelerated scientific progress by decades in just 6 years. Those desperate experiments, conducted under history's most extreme circumstances, created the modern world. For better and worse, we're still living with the consequences.